Good afternoon. It is the 23rd. It is 1 p.m. and this is the Colorado Carbon Energy and Management Commission, and we will take a roll call.
Commissioner Ackerman,
Here.
Commissioner Cross,
Present.
Commissioner Mesner,
Here.
Commissioner Oath,
Here.
Commissioner Robbins,
Here.
Commissioner Shea.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 6 commissioners present.
Great. Good to see everybody. And welcome to the 51 and rising participants that are with us. We are taking up the Cumulative Impacts and Enhanced Systems and Practices Rulemaking. We took Friday afternoon off and this morning, and now we are back. We are at the deliberations stage. We did some assignments of fundamental issues last week, and we're going to start in on sort of working through those. Would remind commissioners that each commissioner has some things that they can report back on. None of the other commissioners are wed to positions. We're just going to start talking and deliberating on specific items of importance that arose within this Cumulative Impacts and Enhanced Systems and Practices Rulemaking. So let's roll up our sleeves and dive in. Commissioners, does anyone desire to initiate deliberations on topics? Commissioner Messner?
I'm happy to dive in, although I know that Commissioner Oath really wants to start.
I'm also happy to start. Yes.
Go ahead.
Commissioner Oath, go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So I had a number of topics I was going to start on. I think I might start with impact area, if that works for folks. Okay, so my thinking on this, well, first I would want to kind of back up a little bit. There was something that Commissioner Messner said in one of the exchanges that resonated with me, which was really thinking about what is this area, and that it's really an area that we're evaluating to sort of evaluate cumulative impacts. An impact area sort of carries to me this knowledge that this is the area that has been or will be or could be impacted. And I think we're really trying to establish what's an area that should be evaluated for cumulative impacts. So I would put out there the possibility of kind of changing our terminology in general around this topic, from impact area to area of evaluation. Just kind of a general thing. I know it is a term that's used in the statute, but I have checked with our AGs. I think we can still define it, somehow in referring back to that statutory use of the term impact area, but then in our regulations and in our terminology, we're really thinking about it as an area of evaluation. So that's one piece of it. And then want to talk about I have some thoughts around process for impact area, and then of course kind of what is the scope of the area for evaluation itself. So I want to start with process though, and the reason this has been weighing on my mind because of we've heard a lot of testimony around what is the appropriate scope for this evaluation. And this is new for us. So I'm cognizant that it's going to be something that we learn about over time about what is the appropriate scope of the area for evaluation. And so, but I think it's really important for us then to kind of nail down what's the right process for it. And so starting from the beginning, there has been some conversation about, that the area of evaluation, I'm going to start using that term if that's okay with folks, but that means impact area or area of evaluation if you all aren't comfortable with that switch. should certainly be something that's discussed at the pre-application consultation meeting. Who is at that pre-application consultation meeting, and whether or not there's also a community meeting, and whether or not this gets just talked about there, I think isn't part of what I'm leading on here. So I kind of want to maybe set that detail aside, even though I kind of, I think it should be discussed at the time with all of those relevant folks. And then after that, based on the information that the director is getting from the folks who are involved in the pre-application consultation meeting, potentially in a public meeting, then the director should make a determination about the appropriate impact area of evaluation. But then as currently drafted, or in the August draft anyhow, the process would be that determination then stands, and an operator would go forward and develop their application, submit it to the commission. We'd be at an OGDP hearing, and if there had been some real contentious issues and thoughts and concerns around the right area of evaluation to be determined right up front, that's not coming to us until very late in the process. And especially as we get our arms around and gain some experience around, when and the area should be expanded, I think that could put us in some really tough situations, and not serving anyone really, if we have a lot of situations as we're learning, where sort of we send things back to the beginning, and have operators have to start over again with a different area of evaluation and come back through with a full application. And this is not to say by any stretch that I think that the commission would be second guessing, or that the director and her team are not going to be doing a fabulous job at using their technical expertise in consultation with the local governments and our sister agencies who will be helping inform that. But just like as we really get our arms around this, there are probably going to be some real tough policy calls as we learn through this. And so I think I would suggest that we bring the commission in earlier in the process. So after the director makes her determination, informed by all of those parties, that would be published. And then there would be an opportunity for folks, if they had a disagreement with what the director's determination is, to be able to request a hearing with the commission. The commission would have the discretion on whether or not to grant that request. I'm cognizant that we don't want to create a situation where it's a potential delay tactic or something, but really is meant to be allowing us to focus in on those areas where there's kind of new, novel, important policy determinations that have to be made. And over time, I think there would be more clarity there. And so things wouldn't necessarily need to be elevated to a hearing. So we would have the discretion on whether or not to grant that hearing. And we'd be looking for information from, if someone is going to request a hearing, they'd need to establish, what is this new or novel or important policy interest that, really warrants a hearing in front of the commission. And others could respond to that, and certainly would want the director to weigh in on that question as well. For us to then decide if we're going to grant a hearing. And then if we do, certainly we have to follow our notice and comment, or notice and hearing procedures. So I know that could potentially add some time into the process. But again, I'm trying to avoid a situation where we get all the way through this and then someone gets kicked back, or having that happen frequently, especially early on in this process. So let's see. And then I think that the last piece of this is around who can request standing. I think my thoughts on this would be, that there are some default provisions in our regulations around, who can meet the standing requirements. And I guess I would start from a place of that those kind of criteria would apply. So I also want to talk about the scope of the area itself, but want to pause and see if you all want to talk about the process piece first.
what does the, in terms of director making a determination and then just make it easy, the operator decides that they want to have a hearing. What do you anticipate? Like, how does the commission make a decision as to whether to grant the hearing? Are we looking at the decision? Is there a portfolio? Is there a packet in terms of our making that decision?
That's a great question. It's as far as I've gotten in my thinking, it's not that we would have the whole packet itself and whether or not we think that a different outcome is warranted before we have the hearings. I think that's what the hearing itself would be for, right? So in determining whether or not to have the hearing, to me, it's more centered around like, is there a difficult policy call that it would be new precedent that we haven't seen before? So what I'm getting at is I can envision some situations where, okay, so you're in your hypothetical, it's the operator has, it must be that the director has decided to expand the area of evaluation, right? And an operator does not agree with that determination, so they've requested a hearing. And so that there would be, is there a new or novel policy call there that the director made? And that would warrant the commission taking a closer look at it or another look at it. So I can imagine some situations where maybe the director is saying, well, commission did this twice already. This is a clear thing. We know that this is the right area of evaluation that would not really warrant a hearing. Or I could imagine the director saying, this is a new situation and it was a tough call for us. We think this is the right call, but differing minds could have come to a different conclusion, kind of thing.
Commissioner Messner?
If you got follow-up to your question, Chairman Robbins, feel free, but I've got some questions.
Well, my follow-up, and just maybe in line with where your questions are, do you envision, Commissioner Oath, creating some form of standard that would allow the director to deviate from whatever is kind of the perfunctory area of evaluation? You talked a little bit about new and novel.
Was your question about creating a standard to allow the director to deviate from the default?
Well, either the director or the commission at the hearing when we're undertaking it, did you contemplate some forms of like, here's the area of evaluation? What we've heard a lot of is like create one area and then you can deviate up or down depending upon. Did you envision some standards for allowing the deviation? Like what would be the criteria for that deviation, whether it's the director's determination or us reevaluating it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my mind, it's kind of as had been drafted and discussed, right? In terms of based on and I'm gonna lose the 3 words, but like the nature, scope, and intensity of the activity or something, right? Like that would be kind of the standard on which both the director and the commission would be evaluating whether or not to deviate from the default. Okay,
thanks. Commissioner Messner?
Thanks, Commissioner Oath. So I also thought about the impact areas from a process standpoint. And now that I'm hearing you talk about it, because I was tasked with some of the process stuff, it might have been helpful for me to go first on the process. But I want to, I understand what you're saying and I really appreciate it. And I want to run a concept by you and see what your thoughts are on it, because and I will go into depth in this when I talk a little bit more about process, but I think of the process of evaluating or determining the impact area as one of kind of shifting from a default. So I do think that this commissioners in this rulemaking need to develop default resource-based impact areas. And because they're areas of evaluation versus areas of impact per se, I think that those impact areas should be broad enough to contemplate potential information necessary to make determinations on evaluating and addressing cumulative impacts, but it's not this. I see a less need to really have these super flexible boundaries, but rather adopt something that is reasonable for the evaluation of and addressing of cumulative impacts from a resource specific thing that don't have to get manipulated very much. And so the way that I was thinking about it was, certainly an applicant going into a pre-application conference or a pre-application meeting and even in just determining as they read the rules and determining what they need to do for their application, knows that there are default impact areas for evaluation. And as they think about what they need to include in their application in the pre-application phases, if there's some compelling reason for that applicant to deviate from whatever the default areas of evaluation are that are developed by this commission, then the applicant can run those ideas by folks that are involved with the pre-application meeting, but the burden of proof needs to ultimately, in my opinion, stay with the applicant. So I think about it the same way I think about alternative location analysis. The determination of locations in the alternative location analysis is the burden on the applicant to determine what those alternative locations are. In the pre-application meeting, they can run certain alternatives by the folks that are involved to get feedback, but the applicant carries that burden on those alternative locations all the way to hearing. And there are situations that we have been in at hearing where commissioners have requested information about sites that were not included in the alternative location analysis. And so therefore, the applicant had to go back to the drawing board and develop information on an alternative site that that wasn't contemplated in their original alternative location analysis. And it did inevitably cause a continuance of the hearing, but it didn't make them go all the way back to the drawing board, right? And so I think about, from a process standpoint, the impact area being the same thing. I mean, we should create reasonable areas for evaluation on the different resources. That creates certainty, that creates a known entity, that creates something that, if an applicant just wanted to do the default, they would just use those areas of impact. But ultimately, if an applicant has a compelling reason to not utilize one of those default areas, then they can run those ideas by staff or CPW or whoever inside the pre-application meetings. They can run it by the community in a community meeting. They could, continue to work through the application process. But ultimately, when it gets to hearing, they'll make that case on why they shifted that impact area to the commission. We'll make a determination at hearing whether it was appropriate or not. Generally, applicants, if they're going to make a shift, they have a very good reason for doing it. But should it be different, then it may just, should the commission determine that it was not an appropriate shift, either an expansion or a retraction or whatever, then we can ask for additional information at the hearing. It may take a continuance until they can provide that information, but I don't know as it goes all the way back to the drawing board. Because again, this is an area of evaluation. And so I think sometimes we make too big a deal out of what these impact areas are, but I also don't want to diminish the importance of them. But from a process standpoint, that seems the cleanest. And the only reason I say that is I'm having commissioners deliberate on an element inside of an application prior to a full application coming to us is going to be really difficult for us to do without getting into potentially the merits of the application. And it also falls in line with the way that we handle variances. So a lot of applicants will include a variance request in their application all the way to the commission hearing without a decision until the commission hearing. If the commission denies that variance request at hearing, it may require the applicant to have to go back to the drawing board and redo parts of their application in order to get back to hearing. But the applicant in that application process is comfortable enough that they may get that variance, that they're taking it all the way to hearing before the commission makes a decision. So I'm not sure we need to take early action, but I do think we need to take action should there be a difference from the default impact areas or areas of evaluation. But I think from a process standpoint, for me, that can happen at hearing and still have a relatively seamless process. But those are just kind of my general thoughts, but don't know if they comport with yours or not.
Commissioner Oath?
Well, I'm happy to, I wanted to make sure if other commissioners wanted to jump in, please feel free. I mean, I think those are really good points. It might not be the right time to do it. It was, I think it has some merit, and in some part it may depend on the other part about kind of where commissioners are as a whole on what the default area is, kind of, and philosophically what you're describing as an approach that would be as expansive, you know, as maybe possible, or you know, sort of the more expansive with the ability to have a smaller impact area versus sort of a default of something like 1 mile, maybe for most things, but maybe some particular resources different with the ability to expand. So it probably, the two probably are tied together.
Yeah, for me, they are, right, because at least the process that I laid out would contemplate resource specific. And when I say resource specific, I don't mean like expansive, like gigantic. I just mean something that doesn't have to be limited with the expectation that it's going to get expanded, but rather is just realistic to evaluate the impacts. And so I guess that's what I mean. So, I mean, I'm not thinking, you know, the entire non-attainment area being an air resource impact area necessarily, right? So something more reasonable as far as an evaluation goes. You know, I think we heard from CDPHE, I think we heard from CPW about some reasonable impact areas that could potentially be considered for certain resources. So I don't want to talk any more about that because I want to hear your thoughts on the actual resource areas first, but it does matter what those defaults are as far as how they get applied, for sure.
Yep. That's fair. That's fair. And so I guess where my thoughts on that are, I think that, you know, what we are doing here, presumably by requiring the cumulative impact analysis, this is a big deal, right? And in my mind, I'm not aware of, you know, this type of analysis occurring in this way, you know, elsewhere. So I think that's a kind of a backdrop to me as I'm thinking about, okay, so you know, this is a really important step, and we need to make sure that when we're getting these analyses that they're focused on the most relevant information. And so when I think about what's the right area, I agree that there should be defaults, and I will set aside the wildlife and biological resources component because I would love to hear Commissioner Ackerman's thoughts on that first. In terms of the rest, I heard, you know, compelling evidence for me from CDPHE, which you alluded to, relating to water impacts in particular. You know, where they were suggesting that the default radius be 2.5 miles, and then if it's a source water area protection, then 4 miles downstream. And so both of those pieces make sense to me, particularly thinking about the fact that we rely on them heavily in their area of expertise, and knowing that, assuming that we do have this process set up such that, the director is taking input from CDPHE early on in the process, if CDPHE is not going to be at every single pre-application consultation, right? They're going to be at certain ones, depending on a number of factors. But they've sort of weighed in and said their thinking here is, in general, that's the right impact area. And so I think if we were to do something different than that, particularly if we were to do something smaller than that, that puts, a sister agency in a position of either not being, having to come to every single one of those and advocate for that, and us having to deal with deviations frequently, or having a lot of inconsistency if there are pre-application consultation meetings that they aren't attending. So therefore, don't have the ability to look at, what are the times when it should be expanded beyond that. So I'm personally convinced that that makes sense for water impacts. And again, I'm setting aside wildlife and biological resources, but for the other areas, I think, I think to me, a 1 mile default makes sense. I think we need to, like I said, kind of be expansive enough that we're really evaluating cumulatively, but not so expansive that we're losing focus on kind of the most relevant impacts and areas. Let's see. I had one other thought on a piece of information that I would like to require for water quality, but that's less relevant to the right area. So I'm going to set that aside. And then I think we also heard a lot of testimony from West Slope operators about just different conditions on the West Slope, and in certain areas of the West Slope in particular. I appreciated the testimony on Friday from TEP and the Karis group on, potentially having a default area outside of the non-attainment area and in areas where there is topographical relief. Then it would go down to 1/2 mile. And I think that makes some sense. I did reach out to them to ask them for a little bit more detail on that topographical relief, consistent with kind of our conversation during the hearing last week, and have added that to the record for everyone's benefit. They did flesh that out a little bit. And so in terms of what do we mean by looking at topographical relief? And so what I heard back was, looking at the immediate land surrounding the location, and does it contain mountainous terrain or demonstrate distinctive features that include, but are not necessarily limited to, bluffs, forested vegetation, rocky outcrops, elevation changes, valleys, ridge lines, or elevation features that eliminate or mitigate the line of sight. To me, I think, we could keep it simple in the regulation and talk about topographical relief, and then add some statement of basis and purpose to sort of round out that this is what we mean by topographical relief. So those are my thoughts on kind of the area of impact or area of evaluation itself, and maybe how it ties to the process piece.
One quick question. I think I heard you say 4 miles downstream from surface water, but I think it's 5. If
You're right.
heard.
I meant 5. I keep saying 4. I don't know why I have 4 in my head. They did testify for 5. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for those initial thoughts on scope and the area of, what are you calling it? Area of evaluation. I'm generally consistent with that approach. Commissioners Cross, Ackerman, Messner, do you guys want to weigh in on the area of evaluation ideas on those fronts as well? Commissioner Ackerman?
Sure, I will. Thank you. And thank you for kicking off the conversation. I appreciate that. Obviously, this is something we've all been thinking about a lot, and there are a lot of aspects to it. I agree, Commissioner Messner, that I think reasonable areas for evaluation, and Commissioner Oath, you restated this as well, is imperative. That we have some degree of standardization of the process is important. I agree that there should be a process for deviation. As part of the testimony, we certainly have talked about being able to propose changes. How I envision this working is CPW or CDPHE, if they have issues with the initial area, I would envision them to be able to articulate how it should be expanded, why it should be expanded. And I would expect that generally to be accepted to some degree by the operator within reason, and accepted as their professional expertise on the issue without coming before us on the issue. And hopefully they'd be able to consider and work that out together. You know, the more I've pondered this, I ponder it a lot from a wildlife perspective, and I want to caveat this by saying I think the specific area of impact, or at least evaluation as we're calling it today, is important. But I also want to kind of step back from that from the wildlife perspective and kind of remind us that currently the wildlife process already allows for these kinds of inclusions. It doesn't have any kind of a minimum area of impact at this point, but when we're talking about dealing with impacts of a proposed operation, the current wildlife process allows for wildlife folks to talk with the operator, talk about what all of the impacts are, including roads, other operations. You know, pipelines is a whole separate issue I can bring up in a minute, and I'm not including with that. But then as they consult on these, and if CPW decides that it is an issue that needs to be addressed, we have a whole process by which they create either a wildlife protection plan or a wildlife mitigation plan. And those plans often include areas and radii associated with different impacts. They're usually different depending on the species at hand and the conditions at hand, but they're tailored to the area and essentially allows for this process of expansion under current regulatory conditions. And so I think from a wildlife perspective, it's actually working quite well, and that wildlife has been able to consider impacts to wildlife on a project by project basis, and then implement ESPs and BMPs through the Wildlife Protection Plan and the Wildlife Mitigation Plan under the mitigation hierarchy to address those. And I think it's been relatively successful. So that said, I'm not sure that the specific area of impact is going to make a lot of difference on the well-by-well consults or the operation-by-operation consults conducted by CPW and their ultimate recommendations associated with the mitigation hierarchy. But I want to kind of decouple that a little bit with, I think it was Commissioner Messner that stated, you know, this is really kind of another area of evaluation for cumulative impacts. And that's where I think we might be able to gain some ground by establishing an area of potential impact. I think it's pretty clear that in many cases, impacts to wildlife are greater than a mile from the working pad surface, and in some cases, greater than a mile from any operation. It's also can be scientifically valid that they're not that far. They're not up to a mile in many cases and for many species. And so, you know, to me, what I've been pondering is how we kind of help this process more bloom into a cumulative impacts evaluation, both at the operation specific level and then overall. And so I think that one way we could do that, again, I'll get back to the question at hand, which is the area of it. Well, I hit that right now. I think a mile is appropriate. I'm fine with that for wildlife. I do think that a mile associated with all operations is a more accurate potential impact zone for wildlife. I think, again, on an operation specific level, that those impacts are going to be evaluated and addressed under either of those regulatory schema. But I think that something that is really important to the process, and this might be expanding the discussion outside of where we want to take it at this point, but is specific inclusions in CIDR associated with mapped surface disturbances. I think it's important to get those more accurate and have those included in a mappable format going forward, and including all historic, well, at least existing historic oil and gas development in that surface disturbance mapping process in CIDR. And if we had that, at least under current conditions, I know it would put CPW in a position where they could better estimate cumulative impacts on a project by project basis and then make better recommended BMPs and ESPs associated specifically with cumulative impacts in that zone. So I guess that's a long, convoluted way for me to say I'm okay with a mile. I am also supportive of a mile from all operations if we go that way, although I think that's harder to administer and evaluate from an operator perspective. And again, I don't think it gains a whole lot in the project specific evaluation criteria. Branching outside of wildlife though, I hear the recommendations of CDPHE, and I think a 2.5 mile default is appropriate. I think the 5 mile downstream in the conditions that their surface water collection areas is appropriate as well. And then the question to me becomes, do we want to start to deviate media by media, or is there, to wrap this back to my original ramblings, is there a way to make sure that we have a system such as the wildlife system where there are protective plans that have to be written up and put in place that will extend through the more project specific expected impacts and mediate for those on a project by project basis, while again being able to take a broader cumulative impacts approach. And the last comment that I'll make on this, again, I'm expanding beyond this specific discussion, is that I'm reminding us that we have a cumulative impacts report that we put out every single year, that one of the purposes of that report and specific mandates of that report is to examine the latest available science and any developments in practices for any specific practice, and then make recommendations to the commission for any potential cumulative impacts issues. And so I think that could be an augmentative approach for taking a look at the year's work, specifically from a cumulative impact standpoint. And I think that broader and better inclusion of CPW and CDPHE in that process might lead to a situation where we're using that project and operation specific data on an annual basis to make recommendations, not just from the director, but informed by all three agencies that are heavily involved in this, that, hey, here are some cumulative impacts that we think you should be watching out for next year, whether those be areas, whether those be specific practices or other things. So again, not a lot of conclusions there, but my rambling way of saying that I think that we have a little bit of a dichotomy of issues here that are interrelated. I think they're sort of working in some ways, and I think they could be improved in other ways. And I think we need to really kind of focus on how are we analyzing the cumulative impacts and what are we doing with that cumulative impacts data in practice.
Commissioner Ackerman, can I have a follow-up question to you?
Sure.
When you spoke to the 1 mile appropriate for wildlife in general, but then you also said all associated operations as opposed to working pad surface. Do you have any idea? Do you want to go down that road? And if so, what does that look like? Or are you more comfortable just keeping the default at 1 mile, and then depending upon case by case circumstances, the director may look at additional associated operations?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. The latter. I think that 1 mile can become very programmatically executable for us. I think it has the opportunity to do what I'm talking about, which is, I don't want to say a separate, but that's what I keep wanting to say, a separate cumulative impact associated with every operation that we can then amalgamate into a better view of the cumulative impacts. As I stated, I think the 1 mile default with opportunities for expansion is in practice kind of already taking place from a wildlife perspective, and I would expect it to continue to take place regardless of the area we set. I mentioned the mile from all operations, and I should caveat that by saying that we don't regulate pipelines, and that's a separate issue that we could maybe talk into, dive into at a different time. And so that would be roads, processing facilities and everything else associated with an operation, and create a buffer zone for cumulative impacts around that. I think on a project by project basis, that would probably be more accurate with regard to cumulative impacts analysis at the micro level. But I do think cumulative impacts analysis at a mile from the pad gives us a pretty good global point of view if we implement it on each project. And then if we specifically are requesting, not us, but if the agency specifically requests an expansion for cumulative impacts purposes, then I certainly see that would be a valid request for expansion.
Thanks for the clarification. Commissioner Cross?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my fellow commissioners for starting this discussion. I think to try and put this in kind of easier buckets, I'll start off saying I 100% think that we should go with the default. I do appreciate a lot of the different proposals that came forward from many of the different parties, whether it be looking at the HUC 12, looking at DAUs, looking at different areas for air emissions. But I think ultimately two main things come to my mind when we look at that. Number one is when we look at the presentations provided by especially our sister agencies, CDPHE and CPW, they were generally okay with the 1 mile. Now I'll add the caveat that with respect to water, CDPHE is wanting the 2.5 miles and potentially the 5, depending on the source, but generally okay and in agreement with the 1 mile. And I think that's also appropriate. The second reason being, I think regulatory certainty is important. I think it's important for operators so they have an understanding as to what issues they're going to want to look at as they begin to put together an application. I think it's important to have regulatory certainty for other stakeholders and the public to get an understanding of if they're looking in this area, how far out are they looking? They're not looking 20 miles away and what might be happening with the migration pattern there, where they're not looking at a tributary source that's 10 miles away doing something else. They have an understanding of this is the area where we're going to be evaluating those impacts. And so I think that from everyone's perspective, having that degree of regulatory certainty is an important aspect. I also think that having a default is critical because of the comments made by CPW and CDPHE that they don't have the bandwidth to be able to consult at every time. And so I think understanding that if we have a default set for the area of evaluation, as Commissioner Oath was calling it, then it's understood that within that area, likely going to be okay with the analysis that's being done. But if they look at that area and say, I know that there's some stuff around here that might require to go beyond a mile, or in some circumstances, for example, the West Slope operators, the way they are in the topography, I think is they're in this little valley, they're not going to have the noise impacts, they're not really going to have some of the migration impacts, et cetera. Maybe less than 1 mile might be appropriate. But that, I think having that default will definitely reduce the amount of consultation discussions about what an area of impact or an area of evaluation should be for those sister agencies that have already expressed a concern with the bandwidth for that. I want to say I'm definitely on board with what Commissioner Messner was saying with respect to some of the process issues. I, for one, have concerns about having a hearing for us to help determine, even in some limited circumstances, to help determine what an appropriate area of evaluation will be when we don't necessarily know what the application is going to entail. And as Commissioner Messner said, it's sometimes hard to deviate from the issues of merits on that application versus some of this preliminary issue. And I think it's 100% accurate to say this burden ultimately will be on the operator to show this area of evaluation was appropriate. And I think critical to this as well is, without going too far ahead of some of the other issues we plan on talking about, but going into some of the other processes that we plan to discuss, such as the pre-application consultation. And I think it goes beyond just CPW, beyond just CDPHE, beyond just the operator, beyond us. You're also going to have relevant local governments, proximate local governments. You're going to potentially have the state land board, as Ms. Trask discussed. You're going to have all these different parties at this pre-application consultation discussing big picture. All right, here's the general proposal that is coming forward. Let's now look at some of the different layers. What are some of the different traffic issues that are coming here? What are some of the different land use plans here? Is this farmland? Is this not farmland? Are there other facilities nearby? And all that is discussed. And as Ms. Trask mentioned last week, it's very, very rare that these parties will leave a pre-application consultation without some degree of agreement on how it should be moving forward. So I would hope that at that point in time, those parties to the pre-application consultation will have an idea of, we've talked, we've discussed, maybe this should be broader than a mile, maybe it should be less than a mile, but ultimately they'll be able to kind of say, yeah, I think this set impact area or area of evaluation is appropriate given the different things that we talked about, the different proposals that are kind of at the basis starting point at that time. And I think one thing that could help with making sure that if there is a deviation from that is, and allowing perhaps a commission review of that as necessary, is in what's being filed, in addition to saying, here's the cumulative impact analysis, you could put in there something that said, make sure you discuss whether additional changes to the area of evaluation were considered, why it was or why it wasn't. I think that that's something that could easily be put into a discussion as part of the filing to say, we stuck with the mile after talking to the relevant local government, after talking to CPW, CDPHE. No receptors were out there that were nearby or close to a mile that would really jump out and make us think that this should be changed. On the flip side, it would also kind of raise some flags and give us an additional reason to look closely if they said, it was actually made smaller, here's why. And then we'll be able to have that notice raised to us that we should be looking at whether something was brought up, why it was discussed. And again, as Commissioner Messner said, the burden's on the applicant to show this is an appropriate area of evaluation for us to consider those cumulative impacts. But I think, to me, one of the things that really sticks out is the amount of expertise that's put into those pre-application consultations should really help determine if a deviation is necessary without going into a resource by resource evaluation of trying to determine, well, for air it should be this, for this species it should be this, for this species it should be, water it should be this, and trying to break it down. I think having that regulatory certainty is a key part of what I think is important here. I think one thing that Commissioner Ackerman raised, which I had definitely planned on talking about at one point in time, but given that he raised it here, I think it's appropriate to address, is the idea of there was some discussion of the working pad surface measurement versus the oil and gas location discussion. And I don't think a lot of the presentations really went into detail on this until the very end of rebuttals. And I think it was helpful discussion for everyone to hear, because I think when you're really looking at it, the working pad surface is where pretty much everything is going to happen. Really, when you start looking at that oil and gas location, maybe you have the topsoil pushed to the side. And really there, I think the only difference you're going to see in the impacts from the working pad surface compared to the oil and gas location, and maybe that topsoil being another 50 feet out or maybe a couple 100 feet out, depending on the situation, is probably going to be the potential disturbance for wildlife and having that additional area of habitat disturbance. And I think that that's an important thing to look at. It's not as though you're having additional emissions. It's not as though you're having additional work done on that other part of the oil and gas location. It's really what's happening, the facilities, the drilling, the completions activities, all that is happening within the working pad surface, and that's how it's designed. And so I do think that the working pad surface is an easier way to do it. And again, I think one of the things that's important with what Commissioner Ackerman noted there is, with respect to wildlife, this is already something that CPW does delve into as they start to look at their evaluations on habitat fragmentation, as they start to look at, is a wildlife mitigation plan appropriate? What kind of things should go into that wildlife mitigation plan? And then I think the last thing I'll say is with respect to the numbers overall. Again, I like the 1 mile because I think it provides that regulatory certainty. I think as we're talking about a true evaluation, as opposed to trying to make sure that these are regulating the direct impacts at this point in time. Certainly nothing with some of the much broader proposals that were given, like the HUC 12, like the DAUs, et cetera. I recognize that CDPHE has been firm in saying that the 2.5 miles and the potential for 5 miles for water is appropriate there. And I've definitely had conversations with a lot of operators that have said that's too aggressive, in part because the regulations that we already have, to protect stormwater, to protect spills, and whether you're looking at the 400 series, the 600 series, the 900 series, the 1100 series, all these protections we have in place prevent those impacts from occurring further downstream. I think recognizing that it's an evaluation. I like the idea of keeping it 1 mile. I understand that the desire of CDPHE to have the 2.5 miles, and so I could be open to that. But again, I think that having that 1 mile default, again, perhaps with the water exception, but having that 1 mile default from the working pad surface is critical. And then I think the other thing that might warrant some discussion that I'm still curious on is some of what CPW talked about as well, with looking at the roads and maybe having that evaluation of a buffer on either side of the road until you hit a public road. And I recognize that in some places that may be fairly minimal. It might be just a small access road off a county road to the well pad site, but in some circumstances that might be a little bit further. And so I'd definitely be interested in hearing my fellow commissioners' thoughts on that buffer aspect of that as well.
Thanks, Commissioner Cross. Commissioner Shea, did you want to weigh in on these issues?
Yeah, I know, I appreciate you all, considering some of the testimony that was originally provided. I just wanted to reiterate that 2.5 miles aligns with existing guidelines under the Source Water Assessment and Protection Program. And then that was also mentioned in the testimony that you heard earlier from CDPHE. And under the ECMC rules 411A1, where a location is in a surface water supply area. So just wanted to reiterate what you heard earlier.
And that's the 5 mile, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, and appreciate everyone's points of view on this. So I'll try to be concrete with my thoughts here. I think the 2.5 mile radius for water evaluation is appropriate, with the 5 mile for the Rule 411 surface water piece. I think that creates regulatory certainty. That's a pretty solid metric that can be known. I appreciate your testimony, Commissioner Ackerman, around the 1 mile wildlife piece. I've heard enough testimony from CPW and other wildlife experts that, while I certainly appreciate your expertise as well, but I'm pretty strong on the need to include oil and gas operations, but make sure that that's clear so that there's regulatory certainty. And for me, those operations constitute elements that could be impactful outside of the working pad surface. So sometimes we hear about remote fracs, right? And so remote fracs potentially have its own sound and impacts associated with that operation that could potentially impact wildlife, or elements like that. I really don't think it's going to expand that area of evaluation very far, but I think it should capture it. And I think it should also capture any new surface disturbances as well. I hear you about the challenges associated with pipelines. I don't know as I need to go there with the pipelines, but I think new surface disturbances associated with roads need to be contemplated, particularly because some roads are only a quarter of a mile. They would already be captured for the most part inside that 1 mile radius that you're contemplating, Commissioner Ackerman. Sometimes they're 2.5 or 3.5 miles though. And so to me, that's different. And so I think by creating that buffer on oil and gas operations that would include new surface disturbances and kind of adjoining operations, does a good job of capturing that area for evaluation and creates regulatory certainty, and I can't imagine would be overly burdensome for operators because I don't really think it expands that evaluative footprint very much then further, but does capture, I think, elements that need to be captured. And so those two to me are resource specific ones that create regulatory certainty. The 1 mile radius for more direct public health impacts from an evaluative standpoint, I think makes some sense. And so I don't know as I really have a problem with the 1 mile from a direct public health impact standpoint. Where I struggle with, and I think maybe it's already captured with the NOx and greenhouse gas intensity rules that are being contemplated already, but I don't know where to go with other air emission evaluations. And so would look to CDPHE and Commissioner Oath for thoughts on that, because I haven't been able to get my head around that one. But when you look at, associated adjoining land uses that would add to cumulative impacts, I'm pretty comfortable with the mile for that one. So to reiterate, I'm at a mile for adjoining land uses and direct public health impacts. I'm at a mile around oil and gas operations and new surface impacts for wildlife, and I'm at 2.5 miles with the 5 mile add-on for water quality. For bigger emissions impacts, ozone precursors and such, I need more input from other commissioners on that one.
Commissioner Oath, maybe bring it back to you.
Sure. Can I ask a real quick clarifying question to you, Commissioner Messner? So when you were talking about the resource specific piece, you talked about water, and then you talked about for wildlife and the area of operations as opposed to the well pad surface. So were you thinking that piece just for the wildlife piece, or for more generally?
I was thinking from a wildlife piece.
Okay, that's what I thought.
I'm doing it because I'm hearing testimony from CPW that was we thought was appropriate and should be included. And so,
okay, thanks. That's what I thought you meant, but just wanted to make sure. So my thoughts on appropriate area for air impacts. I guess I break it down. There are air pollutants that are going to have more localized issues, right? So things impacting people, air toxics, the benzenes, those kinds of things. There are things like NOx, it's going to have a more regional impact. And then there's like greenhouse gases, which is going to have like a global impact. So the way I've been thinking about this, I do tend to think that by taking in compliance with greenhouse gas intensity requirements into consideration as part of the cumulative impact analysis makes sense. I don't think that expanding an impact area for that is workable, doable, right? I mean, you'd be looking at like impact and analysis on a global basis. From a NOx standpoint, I do think we're addressing it very deliberately through kind of my other big assignment. So kind of maybe not punt this to there, but I have some thoughts that we'll want to work through with that piece. So in thinking about kind of the other pieces, I think what we heard from the Air Division in general is that 1 mile, is probably does make sense, and I tend to agree. I don't know that I have any scientific or other reason to say it should be another distance beyond that. And I'm, further thinking about kind of how CDPHE is directed to and in the process of identifying priority air toxics for this purpose, and then we'll be establishing standards, and then there will be sort of an analysis about what is an operator's contribution to that in a permitting context once those standards are set. So I don't see at this time anyways a reason to deviate from 1 mile on those.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Commissioner Oath. Appreciate your perspective on that. And so to again make my thoughts concrete, I'm okay with going with that. And because I do think that there's additional bookends between the NOx intensity targets, the greenhouse gas intensity targets, and the considerations for what I'm calling direct public health impacts, which I think there's a better term for that, which are short-term emissions or whatever that is, the VOCs and the BTECs. So 1 mile is good there. I want to, just so that I'm also clear, I wanted to also indicate that while I acknowledge that topography plays a part on the western slope, for me, from an evaluative standpoint, to create that regulatory certainty, it should stay at that mile buffer around oil and gas operations and new surface disturbance, irregardless of topography. Although that certainly allows for operators to make that argument for topography, just like they would for a different alternative location analysis at hearing. And so I'm certainly not precluding that topography, but I don't know if there needs to be an exception baked into the rules for that, because again, if our goal is regulatory certainty, having clear defaults statewide is, in my opinion, the best approach.
Commissioner Oath.
Thanks for bringing that up. And that's a fair point. I have been thinking about the default in general as being a default with the ability to expand but not contract in general. If we were to stick with the 1 mile default on the western slope, I'm open to allowing things to be smaller based on those types of considerations of being outside of the non-attainment area and there being topographical relief. But just to clarify, like in my mind, the other defaults can only be expanded, not contracted. And so it would be making a special exception for allowing detractions just on that, for areas that meet those circumstances.
Commissioner Ackerman.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to chime in on that. I appreciate Commissioner Messner bringing that up, and I intended to do that as well. I completely agree with the default area. And, to address Commissioner Messner's point, he and I are pretty aligned on this, it sounds like. That was my kind of philosophy for retaining the 1 mile from the working pad surface with expansion for wildlife as well. I do believe that most issues will be encompassed in there. Commissioner Messner is correct, and I agree with him that it's more accurate to include those impacts in the instances where they're outside of a mile from the working pad surface. It's just, do we attempt to keep things uniform as much as possible? And if we deviate for water, I think it makes some sense to deviate a bit for wildlife for accuracy as well. And so while I'm okay with the mile from the working pad surface, as I believe it'll encompass most impacts, I agree that it will more accurately wrap in all impacts if we do it as, a buffer zone, as Commissioner Messner has stated and as CPW testified.
So Commissioner Ackerman, I'm sorry, I'm trying to take notes on deliberations. I thought that I had heard you first opine just 1 mile from working pad surface with a case-by-case basis for sort of other oil and gas operations, roads, et cetera. But maybe I got that wrong, because I think Commissioner Messner was opining 1 mile plus looking at all oil and gas operations. If it's a 3-mile road, then you would look at the whole thing. Do you follow that? Where do you land on that?
I do.
Relish your opinion on that point.
Yeah, I do, and thank you. And I apologize for my lack of clarity on this. I certainly, I'm not switching my point of view at all. My original point of view is that if we're looking for simplicity's sake and uniformity, I do think that 1 mile with opportunities for CPW to expand that for cause makes a lot of sense. As I mentioned in my initial testimony, I think that does a pretty good job of evaluating the cumulative impacts on a pad by pad basis. And I think it will put us in a position where it's pretty easily executable. I do think that, like I mentioned, it's more on a pad by pad basis, more accurate. If any of those operations do expand outside that 1 mile radius, to include those. I don't know that will be the rule. I think that would largely be I don't want to say an anomaly, but I think it would be inside that radius more than it would be outside that radius. And so if you're asking me to say what my specific stance is, Mr. Chair, is that I believe that 1 mile is sufficient. I believe that an opportunity to expand creates an opportunity to address anything that CPW sees as something that would be really impactful to cumulative impacts in that area. I'm certainly open if the commission as a whole wants to talk about expanding protections for wildlife in any capacity.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I think I'm largely in alignment there, and I'm in agreement with the 2.5 and the 5 mile. I could be okay with lesser on west slope, but as long as we allow for retraction and put some information in the SBP that operators can, based upon topography and other concerns on the west slope, make for a smaller one, then I could probably be comfortable with that as well. Commissioner Oath, do you want to sort of lay down where you are, what you would suggest as changes from the August draft, now that you've heard musings from all of us about all this?
I would be happy to summarize what I think I'm hearing us coalesce around. So no one weighed in about the area of evaluation. So I'm going to just assume folks are generally okay with that or think that makes sense, but please speak up if you think that doesn't make any sense. So that would be one change. And then I think what I'm hearing is we're coalescing around 1 mile default from the WPS, except for water, where it'll be a 2.5 mile radius and 5 miles downstream in those certain conditions. For wildlife, the default is also 1 mile from well pad service, but the ability to expand. In general, the director has the ability to expand, and we have the ability to expand beyond those defaults. everywhere except for the west slope really, but not contract, but on the west slope or areas that are outside of the non-attainment area and where there's topographical relief factors, that would be the one case where there would be discretion to make the area of evaluation smaller than the default area. In terms of process, I think, and I really appreciate you all, that was just an idea, and I really appreciate the thoughts of my fellow commissioners on that, and particularly your experience of how it compares with the ALA process and others, and how that has seemed to work. I'm certainly not wedded to that, so to the idea I put out there, and so it seems like we should keep that as is, and not change that process significantly or really at all. So we would leave that, and then I think there's two other things that I might add that I haven't mentioned so far. One would be for water. I would like to add a piece of information that I think should be included in the cumulative impact analysis that isn't in the August draft, but was proposed by one of the parties, by the wildlife hunting and angling groups in particular, and maybe others, but I know that I saw that in their red line, which is I would personally find it really helpful to also have the operator identify the categories of classified uses, anti-degradation designation, water quality attainment status, and the causes of any impairment as used and reported by CDPHE in Colorado's 303D and 305B integrated report of any segment or surface water of the state, any portion of which is located within the area of evaluation. So it's basically getting some additional information about what's the health of the surface water bodies that are in that impact area, and it's pulling from already publicly available information. So that's one piece I would like to have operators also provide. And then the second thing is, I do think that again, this is new, and I think that we may want to revisit or refine this over time. And if we see that there's a lot of change happening to the defaults or otherwise, and so would consider, statement of basis and purpose, just asking for the director to kind of, make sure that we're specifying a time to let's come back and assess whether or not, we've gotten this right. I don't know if that's 1 year out or 2 years out, to, just make sure that we have it, a conscientious timeline to take another look at this and see if we want to make any tweaks based on what we've learned in that period of time.
Commissioner Oath, where then, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to take notes, but where then do you end up with any process changes from the August draft, or are there none?
I think from what I was convinced by other commissioners that we ought to leave it as is, rather than go with kind of the idea that I had floated.
Okay. Commissioner Messner?
Thank you. Appreciate your thoughts, Commissioner Oath. I did want to just clarify, I do have process changes or suggestions. And so it's not, my suggestions are not going to be as the draft is. I have some thoughts on process from, throughout all the pre-application process up until, the first parts of the 300 series rules. And so I just want to put a bookmark there on that, because I'm not sure that the process that's lined out in the August draft for me is right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you believe it's more appropriate to make sure that we are defined in on area of evaluation and then move to process, or do you feel it's important to do the process at this point before we sort of finalize straw vote on area of evaluation?
No, I think we should do the impact area. I think that's good, because then that speaks to the process.
Okay.
I just didn't want I didn't want us to vote on a process as part of determining impact area, because I'll have different thoughts on that.
Okay. Why don't we finalize sort of our thoughts on area of impact or area of evaluation, and then we can turn to the process stuff. That might be a nice segue, Commissioner Messner, if you're comfortable with that.
Sure. And if I could, I wonder, I know that I'm gonna get outvoted on the wildlife area impact suggestion that I had made. But I wonder if commissioners would consider in the statement of basis and purpose, some acknowledgement that an evaluation of, surface disturbances, i.e. access roads and other operations that may occur outside of the 1 area mile of impact, should be considered for evaluation and a cumulative impacts analysis, because I do think that, as Commissioner Ackerman said, those instances are going to be limited, but when they do occur, I am concerned that they're potentially impactful and we would not be capturing those in a cumulative impacts analysis.
Commissioner Ackerman, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually have a similar note in my notes on the statement of basis and purpose, and still kind of concocting thoughts on how that language should look. But I was thinking more along the lines of deference should be given to agencies requesting expansion of cumulative impacts analysis areas. The history so far has been that CPW and CDPHE don't request additional BMPs or ESPs flippantly. They're well defended. And I do think that we should include in the statement of basis and purpose. And I agree with Commissioner Messner. I think it's okay to state that oftentimes there will be impacts outside of that area, and that it should not be a practice to consistently contest moderate expansions by those expert agencies.
So similar thought, same vein, Commissioner Cross?
I think it's appropriate to add that discussion into the statement of basis and purpose, absolutely. So I just want to make sure, though, as in terms of what we're talking about specifically, this is just the defining the area for the area of evaluation, not the process parts that Commissioner Messner intends to talk about. So just that's what 315. Let me see, 315. Am I right in that 315B2A?
I think what I'm understanding is basically from a process standpoint, it's about ensuring that, well, I think still on the table maybe is sort of the pre-application consultation, who's involved, questions about a public meeting and things. But what we're saying we're not changing is that the director makes a determination about the area of evaluation, and that if that's going to be evaluated by the commission, that will happen at the OGDP hearing, with the standard of review being that the commission will only overturn that if it's clearly erroneous. So we will leave that as proposed.
Well, I think Commissioner Messner may want to talk about process, but as of now, this straw vote thingamajig we're doing doesn't include that process. All we're doing is the various areas of evaluation. If we're good here, could I have Ms. Trask or AAG Stafford elevate? Ms. Trask, we've not done this a whole lot, and I'm just wanting to touch base with you guys before we get too far down the road. Is this approach of discussing and then trying to summarize and create kind of a little straw vote, is that helpful to staff, or is this okay? I just want to make sure that the process we outline over the course of the next few days is workable from staff's perspective.
I might defer to the AAGs, but personally, I think it's an appropriate process. I think the conversation is really important for staff to hear. I think it's equally important for staff to sort of hear the line by line decisions. And I think that Commissioner Oath did a really good job just a few minutes ago saying what she's looking to change in the August draft for impact area would be changing sort of the name from impact area to, I believe, area of evaluation, generally accepting a 1 mile default area of evaluation as measured from the working pad surface. Adding language that for water resources, the commission would direct us to take the 2.5 mile or 5 mile approach recommended by CDPHE. And that wildlife impacts, wildlife area of evaluation has the ability to expand beyond 1 mile based on consultation from CPW or recommendations from CPW. And that the commission would like to make a provision that the area of evaluation could be smaller for air resources only on the west slope due to topography, and that should be described within the application. So I don't know if I captured those accurately, but I like the process and that sort of laying them out line by line so that we can capture them, and then we can seek clarification perhaps before each straw vote to make
Yeah,
sure that we
okay.
capture the items correctly.
Then we'll keep going down this path as we talk about different areas. I have a little concern about the last piece, but I think Commissioner Oath probably does too. Commissioner Oath, you're recognized.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Ms. Trask, very much. Would just clarify that at least my intent in terms of allowing a smaller impact area for areas outside of the non-attainment area and topographical relief is not limited to changing it just for air resources, but would be more broadly.
Right. And then you also had your two final pieces of information around water and around a relook. Is that right?
I do. So one would be to add in 315 to see two little eyes, the wildlife hunting and angling groups red line proposal. So looking, and I can send you the exact language, but basically requesting some additional water quality information as part of the cumulative impact analysis. And then the last piece would be requesting some additional statement of basis and purpose language, just noting that, you know, the commission would like the director to come back, and I would look to others for the right period of time here. I don't know if it's 1 year, 2 years, something like that, to just make sure we have it marked somewhere in someone's calendars that we do kind of a check-in and whether or not we want to make some revisions to this.
Great.
I appreciate that. That's very helpful for me.
Commissioner Ackerman, then Commissioner Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And along those same lines, I maybe didn't quite grasp the entirety of the conversation on the expansion either. I think I heard you say, Commissioner Oath, that expansion for wildlife was constrained to wildlife. I feel like the tenor of the discussion, at least my preference, is that that there could be an argument for expansion for cause, for air, or for water beyond what we said as the default area.
Yeah, thanks for that. I agree with you. So whatever I said that was confusing, I apologize. So what I think where I am is that in general, the default, as we said, is 1 mile for everything but water, and the 2.5 or 5 for water. And that in general, that can only be expanded, but cannot be contracted, with the exception that outside of the non-attainment area and areas with topographical relief that could be contracted. And then I think what we talked about is that there was some request for some statement of basis and purpose language around, for wildlife in particular, there may be it may be warranted to expand it based on surface area impacts, as Commissioner Messner noted.
Great. Commissioner Cross, did you have anything, or was your question answered?
That was the point I was going to make, is making sure it wasn't just an expansion for wildlife, but for potential other impacts as well.
Commissioner Messner?
I wonder, I'm a little uncomfortable with the 1 mile, calling it a 1 mile default, because that's not what I'm hearing. What I'm hearing is that we are doing a resource specific impact area determinations, and that just happens that some of those impact areas happen to be 1 mile, but some of them are 2.5 miles that can go to 5, and some of them are 1 mile that could be expanded based on considerations. So for me, that's just a terminology issue, but But to me, what we're determining here is a resource specific area of evaluation or area of impact. And we're just determining that certain resources have similar impact areas. So I'm just throwing that out there as a consideration as well. Because for me, well, I'll just leave it at that.
All right, well, and I think our AAGs can try to capture this notion within the statement of basis and purpose would make some sense. If we are at a point where we feel comfortable with sort of that straw approach, I don't think we need to do more on that. I would suggest let's take, maybe 5 minutes and fill up your water bottle, et cetera, and then come back at 2:32, and then we'll take up, if everybody's good with it, Commissioner Messner's initial thoughts around process. Okay, commissioners, just for your awareness, over the break, AG Davenport and I chatted, and he is going to be in charge of keeping a scribe going of our thoughts and notions in terms of where we may end up on various things. And so we'll have that available for us. AG Davenport, thanks for being voluntold to do that.
Of course, Chair. One question. Do you want me to share my screen so that the commissioners and the public are seeing the development of that document in real time? I believe that's a process that the commission has followed in other rulemakings.
But I don't want to bog us down all that much. Maybe what we can do is at the conclusion of each morning or each afternoon's deliberations, we can take a quick look at it and make sure that it's accurate kind of thing, as opposed to hogging up the screen the whole time. And that's just one commissioner's thoughts, but I think everybody's nodding up and down. So let's do it that way.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Messner, do you want to lead on some process discussion?
Sure. Give me just a second and pull up the right screen here. So I was tasked with looking at local government involvement, pre-app, consider and defer, so on and so forth. Those are really the first few pages of rules in the 300 series. And so I just kind of went through the early 300 series process. And the first one that I'll focus on is the 301 F1, which is the pre-application meeting. And so I'm calling it a meeting. I know in the draft rules it's called a consultation. I'll explain why here in a little bit that I'm calling it a meeting. But I asked a lot of questions about this during the hearing. I also did some research over the weekend, and almost all local governments who are the entities with the most experience in land use processes, because they've always had that authority, have pre-application meetings. And it's interesting because the purpose of almost all these pre-application meetings in my research, and at least what I've heard from the testimony, is almost universal. And so, in the rulemaking, we heard from Adams County, we heard from the allied local governments, the Western rural local governments, and I did research on the internet of some other ones as well. And literally, like, the first 4 pages of local governments pre-application meetings, they're almost all identical. So whether that's Greeley, Colorado Springs, Lafayette, Canyon City, Eagle County, Jefferson County, Morgan County, they all have really, really similar processes that are similar to what you heard from in testimony during the hearing from the local governments. And so generally speaking, these pre-app meetings are high-level discussions between the applicant, staff, and any relevant departments or agencies to discuss various processes, standards, and submittal requirements, and to answer any questions that the applicant has about the process or the requirements. They're informal meetings. It is clear in the purposes that, almost again, universally, that no decisions will be made in the pre-application meetings, but rather it is to provide clarity to the applicant, what some of the expectations may be of the applicant, and to help clarify the process and answer questions and provide information to the applicant. It's also clear in all of the examples that I looked at that the meeting does not take the place of a formal review, referral, and consultation process, so the formal application process. And so I think it would benefit us to utilize the expertise of the local governments in their land use processes and helping develop the process, for ECMC in this particular, in this rulemaking. I am a little concerned that the August draft rules and in some of the presentations by staff, that ECMC's pre-application meeting, has become more than what would typically be seen in a pre-application meeting in most other circumstances. And so I've provided comments, to these different rules that I think can alleviate that issue while still providing that opportunity and the benefits of that kind of coordination with staff and the agencies to get the applicant to receive the information necessary to ensure that there's a clear and efficient application process, but also maintain the burden of proof that the applicant has throughout our review process. So that's kind of my preamble. And so I'll start off with some suggestions in 301 F1, which is the coordination with local government and federal agencies, that talks about this local government and federal agency pre-application meeting. I've got some language that I would suggest in lieu of what's provided in the draft that indicates that prior to an operator submitting an OGDP or CAP to the commission, at the request of the relevant local government or federal agency, the director will participate in a pre-application meeting. This meeting can be coordinated and held by the relevant local government or federal agency, so long as it meets the requirements of Rule 301G, or it can be coordinated and held by the director. I do want to memorialize in here intent, and so I'm sure there's lots of different language that can be utilized, but I do think that it is possible for the local government process to be substantially equivalent to the process at the state level for a pre-application meeting. But I do want to make sure that the elements in 301G at the local government level are followed, and if they're not, then they would need to be done at the state level. And so I do want to make sure that there's the efficiencies of being able to share those pre-application meetings between the local government process and the state process. But I do think there has to be a baseline for what needs to be included in those. I move on to 301G, which is the general pre-application meeting. And so in here, I kept the language that was in the August draft, but I included a line at the bottom that indicates so long as it meets the requirements of Rule 301G. And again, that goal is to make sure that we have a baseline for what needs to be included in the pre-application meeting. In G1, and if I have these messed up, but the purpose and content of the pre-application meetings, because my numbers get messed up sometimes when I'm cutting and pasting, I did make some changes to this. And so, again, I'm calling it a pre-application meeting. And in this one, my language is, the director will participate in one or more pre-application consultations with the operator and all persons identified pursuant to Rule 301G2. I struck out the line that states that the pre-application consultation process is a formal consultation process, because almost universally in the local government, it's an informal process. There are some local governments that have an informal process and then a formal process, but in this one, I just struck it out, and I'll explain why later. The purpose of the pre-application meeting is for the director, operator, and the invited participants in Rule 301G2 to engage in high-level discussions regarding various processes, standards, and submittal requirements, and to answer questions the applicant has about the process or the requirements regarding the proposed oil and gas development plan or CAP. During the pre-application consultation, the director operator participates may discuss some or all of the following items. And so I made some adjustments in that paragraph, and then let me go on to what gets discussed in the pre-application process. So A, oil and gas location siting, including whether the proposed location is within a disproportionately impacted community, has residential building units, high occupancy building units, school facilities, or childcare centers within 2,000 feet of the working pad surface of such a location, is within high priority habitats, or is in proximity to other sensitive receptors that may need consideration. And so there's changes in A that I made, but it's trying to capture things that might get discussed from a general standpoint, high level, about oil and gas location siting. So B would be the submittal requirement considerations for alternative location analysis. So it's a conversation about, what needs to be submitted in the alternative location and considerations that an operator should make in developing their alternative location analysis. It maintains the burden of proof with the operator to do the alternative location analysis, which I think is a really important piece. But it is an opportunity to discuss submittal requirement considerations for that alternative location analysis. C, go ahead.
Just, do you have red lines, or do you want to talk through this and then share? And the only reason I'm saying that is our scribe can't keep up with all the changes you're suggesting.
I have red lines. I mean, they're Messner lines, right? So they're a little messy, but I can certainly provide it. They're written, so, or they're typed. So, is this okay the way I'm going through this? Are you able to follow me, or should I just talk more broadly?
Personally, I would love to hear you talk more broadly and like,
Okay.
what are the concepts? That's just one, but my brain's not able to track the specific changes because I don't see them. But that's just one commissioner. And we want to get this right, guys. And there's no right, wrong, or otherwise doing it. Does anybody else have thoughts and want to weigh in? Commissioner Oath?
Actually, I have similar thoughts because Commissioner Messner, I really want to follow, and I apologize, but I'm having a hard time also like understanding kind of conceptually what you're proposing to change. So however we want to do it, whether it's so that we could see your red lines and follow along with you, or talk more conceptually, whichever you think.
Okay, well, I'm happy to share these red lines. But here's the big picture, right? So that pre-application consultation needs to be high level. It needs to be treated like most local governments treat pre-application meetings. It needs to, talk about cumulative impacts considerations, but it shouldn't come to a conclusion or a decision. And so when I talk about submittal requirements for alternative location analysis that was going to be discussed, it's talking about conceptual things that should be thought about, allowing the applicant to ask questions, but not making a determination or a conclusion for the applicant at the meeting. That's the applicant's burden of proof to do. From a cumulative impacts consideration standpoint, they can talk about NOx and greenhouse gas intensity targets. They can talk about impact areas, and this is where the impact area fits in for me, is that they should just acknowledge that there are these resource-specific impact areas that are baked into the rules, but the pre-application meeting can talk about processes that an applicant can go through to propose something different, but shouldn't make a determination of the impact area at that meeting, but can provide feedback to the applicant and let the applicant make a decision if they would like to evaluate that impact area into something different than what is baked into the rules that we just talked about. And then it goes through to talk about the same kind of thing with the best management practices and enhanced systems. They can talk generally about, things that they should be considering when they are proposing best management practices, or things that agencies may be considering when they're going to look at it, but no determinations or conclusions should come out of that as to what the best management practices or enhanced systems of practices should be. Same with submittal requirements for lesser impact exemption requests. There should be no conversations about conditions of approval at a pre-application meeting, because conditions of approval are something that happen way further down in the process once there's actually an application. You know, anticipated milestones are good, amended permit statuses are good. You know, having conversations, because the relevant local, approximate local governments will be there, about local land use plans, including topics related to surrounding compatibility, comprehensive area plans, sub-area plans, and future land use designations. These are all good things to be talking about, but, you know, again, at a high level. And so that's, to me, what a pre-application meeting could and should be. And that helps the process and keeps the process moving forward, but it does not take, you know, does not replace the formal review process that includes formal consultations, formal referrals, you know, director's recommendations. You know, that process needs to stay separate, and that's where evaluation and decisions happen, not in pre-application processes. You know, and so that's what my red lines will talk about, and I hope it's clear in my red lines. And it also talks about the participants that need to be in pre-application meetings. And, you know, for me, a pre-application meeting, again, an informal meeting, is not a place for public involvement. I have a suggestion for public involvement in a pre-application process that's also highlighted by a number of different local government processes, including Garfield County, Adams County, and others that testified. But to the participants, it needs to be, at a minimum, the operator, the director, and the local governments. There should also be, you know, federal and state agencies with land use jurisdiction, CDPHE, CPW. I did agree in my red lines with Adams County's suggestion that all local governments within well, they suggested 3 miles. I went to 1 mile of the proposed oil and gas location, should be included in pre-application meetings. And the community liaison, as appropriate, if it's within a disproportionate impacted community, should also be involved. And so generally, I go through with the timing of the pre-application meeting, the waivers of the pre-application meeting, and the results of the pre-application meeting in these red lines. And then the pre-application notice to nearby residents, you know, is also an important point of this. You know, and I pulled suggestions from both Oxy and Green Latinos on this, that if a proposed location is within a ½ mile of an RBU, HOBU, outside of a DIC, or within 1 mile of the same within a DIC, there would be notice to nearby residents. So that's the pre-application meeting piece. And I'll, before I want to pause here in a second and get questions about that, but then the way to involve the public in the pre-application process, as identified by, you know, Garfield County and Adams County, is to have a pre-application public hearing. And so the language I have around a pre-application public hearing is that the applicant will hold a pre-application public meeting 30 days prior to submittal of a no GDP or CAP application for residents and administrators of schools and childcare centers within the notice requirements of 301H. The purpose of the pre-application public meeting is to present and discuss elements included in 301G1 and to solicit input from community members that may influence decisions that may be made in an application prior to its submittal. This meeting shall meet the accessibility requirements provided by the Environmental Justice Act and may be held in person or virtually. The director and the applicant, as well as the community liaison as applicable, will be present at these pre-application meetings, and a summary of the meeting and any concerns identified will be included in the application and the director's recommendation. And so that, you know, the goal of the pre-application hearing which is different than a hearing held during, the ECMC commission process, is to solicit feedback from the community and hear their thoughts that may influence an applicant's decision on where they may site a location, operations that they may consider, alternative location analyses that they may consider, or impact areas that they may consider. So it's that opportunity for the community to be able to engage in the process in a pre-application process, understanding that an application is not in yet, and it's really an information gathering process for the applicant. And so I will pause there for a second because that was a lot, but I want to see if there's any thoughts or feedback on that pre-application process and pre-application hearing process.
Commissioner Ackerman?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you for laying that out for us, Commissioner Messner, for the work you did on that. I really appreciate it. It's very helpful. And I would agree with seeing the red lines will be helpful as well. Just to be clear, I don't think you're suggesting this, but just to be clear, you're not suggesting that pre-application public hearing take any place of the other community outreach efforts that are to come later in the process?
No, in addition.
Thanks.
Commissioner Oath?
I agree. This is really helpful. So, when you talked about how like the determinations about impact area and other things should not be made at this pre-application meeting, and maybe this isn't the time to talk about it, but I'm like, when do you envision that happens, or assuming that it's the director who's making the determination, but I think that maybe I heard you say the operator does. So I want to understand that.
The operator has the burden of proof and is making a determination. So they're making a determination, just like with alternative location analysis, where they're going to propose their alternative locations in their alternative location analysis. Now that may be informed by information gleaned at the pre-application meeting, but it is not cooperatively developed at the pre-application meeting. It's developed by the operator because the operator has the burden of proof. And so impact areas are the same way. The director is not determining an impact area. We as the commission determine an impact area based on what's baked in the rules, which, as indicated before, is 2.5 mile radius for water. It's 1 mile for air. It's 1 mile for wildlife with some consideration for, additional surface impacts. That's the impact area. Now, if the operator wants to solicit some feedback on, what they could consider for expanding or detracting that impact area, they could do that at the pre-application meeting, but the operator will propose that in their application, and the commission makes the determination at hearing whether or not that modified impact area is appropriate or not. And the operator is going to have to back up their determination as to why they chose a different impact area, and their evidence could include, information gleaned at the pre-application meeting from CDPHE or CPW, or information gleaned in the formal consultation process, when referrals went out to CDPHE and CPW. That's how they can make that showing, but that the commission makes the determination. So the director has no burden of proof at that pre-application stage. The consulting agencies have no burden of proof. It's the applicant that has the burden of proof. The other folks involved with that process, the local governments, are able to provide information, feedback, and the lay of the land, so to speak, of things that the operator needs to be thinking about. It's no different than if a subdivision is being proposed in a pre-application meeting. You're not sitting down there working with staff to figure out exactly what needs to be built in that subdivision. You're highlighting the things that the applicant needs to be thinking about in order to get through the process easier. but not making a determination for the applicant what they're ultimately going to propose, right?
Commissioner Messner, can I summarize what I think I'm hearing you say and see if I'm close to getting a correct understanding?
Sure.
One, you are arguing for moving away for determinations at any of the pre-app stages.
Correct.
Two, you want the pre-app stages to generate information back to the operator so that they can then make a determination when they make their filing of impact area, so that they're not just filing impact area without that informational pieces coming in from the pre-app stage.
Correct.
And then three, operator makes its filing, and at some point following that filing, the director would make a confirmation or not that the impact area as proposed is going to be adequate for a review of the proposed OGDP.
Inevitably, they'll do that because the director needs to make a recommendation, right? So through technical review, the director could tell the applicant, hey, I'm not comfortable with this impact area that you're proposing. If you don't modify it, I'm going to have a hard time writing a recommendation for approval in this director's recommendation, right? Now,
yeah, and I guess what I was getting at is we need to develop a process where the information comes into the applicant who carries the burden at all times. Your process that you're generating does that through pre-app. They then make a filing. At some point, kind of like completeness determination, at some point, the director and our staff, who are the subject matter experts, needs to confirm that this is, quote, complete from an impact area proposal, so that they can then move forward with actually the technical analysis.
sure. So again, I correlate this with the alternative location analysis, right? So the staff are in their technical review are looking at the alternative location analysis. They may determine through technical review that they would like to see another location evaluated. And so an applicant has the option of either choosing to evaluate another location or not and taking it straight to hearing. It's up to the applicant. They have the burden of proof. But what staff is saying is that for staff to fully be able to evaluate this application, they would benefit from another location being evaluated, right? And so this impact area piece is no different. First of all, I want to encourage operators to use the default impact areas, right? They're the ones that are baked in the rules. And if you want an easy path forward, you use the impact area that are in the rules. But if you want to modify that, then you have the ability to do that. You're going to have to make a showing in your application as to why that's appropriate. And the director in her review is going to have to decide whether for her review process that impact area is appropriate or not. And that would be reflected in the director's recommendation. And then we as a commission would also independently review that impact area in our review and determine whether it's appropriate or not if it was a modified impact area. So I don't think it's much different than how we currently review ALAs or even how variances come through the process as part of OGDP applications.
Further questions for Commissioner Ackerman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just that last comment you made, Commissioner Messner, I just wanted to get some clarification. So I appreciate the thought that went into this, and I'm very aligned with it, but I didn't quite understand. Are you saying that then when an OGDP actually, or a cap actually comes before us, there would be an opportunity for the commission to talk about changing the area of impact that the application was based on, or what was the mechanism there for the commission reviewing?
Well, just like with anything, I mean, the commission can recommend a change for any part of the application, or deny the application if that applicant is not willing to make certain changes that the commission determines are necessary to ensure protection of public health and welfare, safety of the environment. But we would have to, I mean, there would have to be, the applicant would have to fail in their burden of proof of making a showing that the impact area that they proposed, is reasonable or necessary, and is protective and meets the rules in the act, right? And if they make it through the director's recommendation stage and the director seems that it's okay and it comes to the commission, I would assume that generally speaking, the commission is going to be okay with it because the applicant has provided pretty good proof up until that point. But there's always the option for the commission to make a determination, just like with alternative location analysis, that the impact area may not be appropriate. And so may ask the applicant to go reevaluate that impact area and submit a new impact area evaluation in order to and then continue the hearing until that's done, and then the commission can make a determination of that. So for example, in an alternative location analysis scenario, I can contemplate at least one time, although my memory is bad, where application hearing was continued so that the applicant could go evaluate additional alternative locations because the commission determined that the alternative location analysis was not adequate, or they didn't have enough information to make a determination on the alternative location analysis. And so it would be that same process. I don't think it would be overly burdensome. I don't think it would be very often that happens, but the commission needs to maintain its authority to make a final determination on what they think is protective application. And I think that the current draft doesn't do that, and I think this process does do that.
Thanks, I understand. So you're not proposing a separate commission review specifically of the area of impact.
No.
Just talking about overall commission authority associated with application materials. I appreciate that. That's correct.
Commissioner Shea?
Yeah, I just wanted to get little clarity on something that you had said, that the 1 mile approach being the easy path. I just want to make sure that we reiterate the fact that, the testimony and deliberations that were discussed, those boundaries are protective and reasonable and not necessarily an easy path.
Yeah, I'm talking about a process path, right? So if you're not going to you wouldn't have to develop an argument on why you're modifying an impact area if you use the default areas that are baked in the rules, and they're baked in the rules because this commission will determine if it's protective.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Oath, then Commissioner Cross.
Thanks. Thanks for this, Commissioner Messner. Really liked it. So I think I understand that. So we would, as commissioners, we would get to hear if there were differing opinions about an impact area than what an operator submits to us. Because if the director had thoughts on that, it would come out in the director's recommendation. If CDPHE had different thoughts, it would come out in their consultation letter. Same with CPW. If local government had differing thoughts than what was put together, they, I guess, submit a public comment. And then if the public had different thoughts, they would submit public comments. So that's how we would know if there were folks who had provided input that wasn't accounted for in what the operator submits.
That's correct. And there's also a summary of the pre-application meeting that's included as part of the application as well. And so you would have the benefit of that as well. As to the local governments providing public comment instead of a formal referral, I have a suggestion later on for that one. But
okay. Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Messner. I want to delve into this a little bit to make sure I understand. The impact area still will be discussed at the pre-application hearing, even though the determination is not made at the pre-application hearing?
The impact area could be discussed. I mean, I would think it would be less of a discussion at the pre-application meeting if they're utilizing the impact areas that are baked in the rules. But if they're not, then it would be perhaps a part of the discussion, but there wouldn't be this decision or cooperative decision by all the entities as to what the impact area would be. The impact area determination burden still lies with the applicant, informed by information and questions that are provided and answered at that pre-application meeting. Right?
And I fully agree with that. I'm just trying to make sure that I understand kind of the process moving forward. And one of the things that is in the draft rules is providing I think it's 20 days time for the operator to at least know what the director thinks about the impact area determination, now the area of evaluation determination. And so
that would be removed.
So the only understanding of it would be at the director's recommendation at this point in time.
Or through the technical review. Well, there would at the technical review process, there could be some questions and thoughts, presented by staff to it and the director's recommendation, but there's still back and forth happening between staff and the applicant during the technical review process.
Okay. And if they do use the 1 mile area of evaluation, 2.5 for the water, would it then still have the back and forth and the potential for the director to say disagree with the area of impact, the area of evaluation determination? I'm fully on board with us being able to say, no, you still have to carry your burden of proof here. I'm just kind of curious to make sure I understand.
There would have to be a special circumstance for that, right? So I mean, if during the CPW formal consultation process, in their comments, they indicate that there's some reason that area of impact should be expanded, as we talked about in the previous impact area discussion, then they would include that in their formal consultation, and it probably would behoove the applicant to consider that in their ultimate determination of impact area, right? And so I think that there is the possibility that impact area, even from a default standpoint, could shift during technical review. Maybe not. I think most often it would not, but I mean, I think that there's always those circumstances. That's why you have a referral and consultation process. But that also, if it's easily identifiable at the pre-application meeting, with the very limited information you're going to have in a pre-application meeting, it could be identified there as well. But you may have more information once you've gone through completeness and do a formal consultation where an agency or an internal referral could identify an issue that wasn't contemplated at the pre-application meeting and could be brought up during that formal review process, which is why we have that.
Okay. And fully agree with that. I know CDPHE's formal consultation happens after the completeness, for example, which is why I just want to make sure.
They all do.
I just want to make sure I understand the timing of this. And if it's not something that comes up different with respect to the area of evaluation. And so, they talk about it a little bit at the pre-application meeting. Everyone says, nothing's jumping out to me as suggesting a change is warranted here. It comes through. Will that still be a part of the director's recommendation in the review that, yes, the appropriate impact area is the 1 mile, or is it just because it's assumed and kind of on the default that it's just moves on?
The latter.
Okay. Thank you.
Say that again, Commissioner Messner.
I just said the latter of what he said.
And what was the latter? Sorry, I was typing.
Say the latter again, Commissioner Cross.
So the idea being essentially, if there is something that warrants a change in the area of evaluation, then they have to go through and make sure that that's shown throughout. And then ultimately in the director's recommendation, he's saying that, and I'm sorry if I get this wrong, but in the director's recommendation, the director would say, yes, I agree with the applicant's proposed area of evaluation, or no, I don't. And then, but if it just goes with the default 1 mile for the 2.5 of the water and it moves forward, there wouldn't be that separate determination in the recommendation. It would just be, yes, we're using the 1 mile default.
I mean, I assume that, and this is more of a question for our staff than commissioners in terms of how they process these sorts of things. But I assume, thank you. I assume, Ms. Trask, that if we were to move down a path like this and we do more of a pre-app in the pre-app as opposed to what the current version was doing with the pre-app, which was making it more, that the operator would make a filing and then staff would, as it's going about determining whether that filing is complete, you could provide direction perhaps to the operator that, yeah, generally we think this area of evaluation is going to be good for terms of this permit. Or you might need to say the opposite. I think you could probably do a little better. And then ultimately it's up to the applicant to determine what they're going to do. Is that a fair summary of how this would shake out?
Yes, I believe that's a fair summary. I think typically during the completeness review, if staff identifies something either missing from the application or that is weak in the application, we would indicate our concern to the applicant and give them whatever opportunity they wanted to improve their application. Resubmit it to us, we re-review completeness and then would make a completeness determination based on their response. We sort of do this already with 604 before substantially equivalent. That one's a little bit unique because in our current rule language for 604 before, only the commission can make a finding of substantial equivalence. And so staff, during our completeness review, we look at what the operator has provided in their application, and we can give them sort of our subject matter expertise to say, we think you're probably good with this, or we think that you might want to add more to this. We can still pass completeness on an application, leaving that substantially equivalent piece undetermined, because that, again, per our rule, can only be determined by the commission. So we could do something similar with the impact area or area of evaluation. It's really up to the commission whether or not you would want the director to make a firm determination based on staff's completeness review and the back and forth staff would have with the applicant.
Well, I, as one commissioner, would like you to do that, kind of like you do with the ALAs now. You sort of suggest during your review, I don't know that you really have fully vetted the different locations that could be alternatives. And I think it would be helpful for the operators to get some sense that, yeah, we're using the areas of concern, the default, and that's fine. Or we're not, we've retracted it, and then provide some perspective. Again, it's not binding, and it's just in terms of providing some feedback to the operator so that they're not waiting until commission hearing to get the complete, understanding of impact area or area of evaluation, whatever we're calling it now.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think that's how we currently do our completeness review. We provide guidance to the applicant at the pre-app meeting or consultation. And then when the application is submitted, we review it to see if the items that were suggested at the pre-app have been adequately addressed, both for CPW, for CDPHE, for the local government, for whoever provided that input at the pre-application meeting. Staff does have a really robust process right now with how completeness is done and how sort of those information gaps are identified and shared with the operator. The application can be pushed back to draft. We give them a spreadsheet with all of our notes sort of line itemed out, and let the operator decide how and when they want to make those application revisions. They can then resubmit the application. We re-review it. If they've addressed all of the points that staff has identified for them, then we feel comfortable, generally comfortable passing completeness at that point. If they, if the applicant resubmits the application and there are still pieces that are a little vague or seem to be outstanding, we can ask them again if they would like to make those changes. Sometimes operators will say, no, we want to run with this. And so then we can pass completeness, but we would write a clearly articulated note in the director's recommendation that staff requested additional information about XYZ and the applicant chose not to provide that. So that's how we generally address through the completeness process the issues that staff has concerns about a hole or a gap in an application.
Commissioner Messner, does this explanation about how things are happening on the ground, is that consistent with your vision that you tried to create here?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it actually works too. I mean, it works like it's supposed to, right? There's that piece in the pre-application. It works in conjunction with it. I'll just leave it at that. So I mean, the completeness piece, you know, is that contact point with staff to revise the application and come to completeness. There's another opportunity with staff to go through a technical review, and staff will make their independent determination as to whether they think the information is protective in the application and whether the information is accurate, and, you know, impact areas have been evaluated correctly, ALAs have been, you know, provided correctly. They'll make their independent determination. We make our independent determination based on the same information. And so I think it all works together.
Other questions for staff now that we've got staff up on this topic? And thanks so much for paying attention and popping back up and being there as an assistant for us. Commissioner Ackerman?
I don't have one for staff, Mr. Chair, but I do have a clarification for Commissioner Messner. I'm happy to hold that if there are other questions for staff.
I don't think I'm seeing questions for staff, so go ahead.
Thanks. Just a little more clarification, if you wouldn't mind, Commissioner Messner, and I appreciate your indulgence here with the public pre-application consultation. I'm trying to figure out exactly how, if there are opportunities for the public to understand what the proposed area of evaluation might be at that point. My previous understanding was yes, but I think we kind of talked about that, something that may come up at the pre-application meeting between CPW and CDPHE. And so is the express intent to make that information available at the pre-application public consultation as well?
I think it would behoove the operator to provide it there, but I'm not sure that there's necessarily a requirement. If the operator is going to use the impact areas baked into the rules, they can indicate that. But generally speaking, the same information that would be discussed at the pre-application meeting would be discussed at the pre-application public hearing. And so it's those same kind of things, and an opportunity for the public to be able to provide input, you know, on conceptually on wherever that application's at, because different applicants may have different levels of specificity in their application at that stage. the applicant may just be soliciting information generally. They may have a proposed location. They may have, you know, a DSU identified. They may have already done a conceptual ALA. So I think different applicants will have different levels of information that they may want to share, but generally speaking, I think that the level of information that is at the pre-application meeting should carry over to the pre-application public hearing so that residents are able to understand conceptually what an operator may be considering, even though it's not even an application yet, and that's important to understand, and then be able to provide impact to the operator about, hey, you're not thinking about this, or what about this? Why are you know, are you thinking about these things? You know, or the school buses goes by this way, or I mean, I don't know, whatever the important relevant information that might need to get provided to the operator could get provided at that. And, you know, another piece of information for that is who is invited to that pre-application public hearing. And right now I've got in my red lines that if a proposed location is within a half mile of an RBU or HOBU outside of a DIC or within 1 mile of an RBU, HOBU, school or child care center within a DIC, the operator will notify residents or administrators that it is no less than 30 days prior to submitting an oil and gas development plan that it intends to, and then provide information about the public hearing at that meeting as well. And it's not a public hearing, it's a public meeting. Sorry, I keep calling it a public hearing. It's a public meeting, pre-app public meeting.
Thank you.
Kind of come to a standstill. Further thoughts on all this? Commissioner Messner or Commissioner Cross, go ahead.
Thank you. And I'll just say, as I'm trying to make sure that I fully understand this, I think I'm in agreement with what you say. I fully am on board with it's the operator's burden to make sure they have this shown. I just want to make sure that it's known. And as we've been kind of talking it out, I think what I'm hoping to understand is what's getting as well. And I think it, especially with what Ms. Trask said, these issues can and should be discussed at the pre-application meeting with local governments, with CDPHE, with staff, et cetera. They should be talked about. And hopefully, as Ms. Trask said last week, everyone kind of talks through their issues. And she said it's very rare that people leave that meeting without kind of at least an agreement on how to move forward. Otherwise, they usually have another meeting. And so hopefully from there, they then are able to, again, discuss it at the public pre-application meeting. And then should there be any additional disagreements on the area of evaluation, again, staff can talk to them about it during that review, the completeness review, hopefully the decision's made. And really at that point in time, if they continue to want to do something different than what's been talked about, different than what's been proposed, it's kind of on them to see if they can make it through on their own, because it's their burden. Am I generally summarizing that correctly?
Yeah, there's a couple of pieces there. So one, I agree that the applicant needs to carry the burden of proof through the whole process. When you say words like agreement or consensus, to me, that means a decision has been made. And that is explicitly not what the pre-application meeting is. And so that pre-application meeting is information, you know, providing as much perspective to the applicant as, you know, anyone involved in that pre-application seems would be willing to do. And then the applicant should do what they want with that in developing the application. Now, additional touch points happen at completeness, and that may be a little bit of a back and forth, but that's not what I'm talking about in the pre-application process, right?
Yeah, and fully understand what you're saying there. And I guess agreement, I think it's more so one would hope the operator, in conjunction with the sister agencies, with staff, with relevant local governments, et cetera, can kind of stack hands and, ultimately it's still their application. They get to still put forward what they're going to put forward. But one would hope that at that point in time, they can kind of come to an understanding of this is what everyone thinks is in the best interest moving forward. And so if you don't go forward with that, that's kind of at your own risk as you move forward. And again, it's your burden to prove it moving forward.
Yeah, again, I mean, you're making a decision there, and so I would say no. And that's my, old county attorney on my back telling me that that's not appropriate, but rather, you're providing information to the applicant. The applicant can agree or not agree, and you're not telling them that they have to do this or not do this, but that you're telling them these are the things you really need to be thinking about. And then that once the application is submitted and that completeness is being determined, then what you're talking about, that back and forth, begins to happen. That's not necessarily the pre-application process, right? So that's why what I have written in there, that it's clear that no decisions are made. This is really helpful to the process in the long run. Otherwise, the burden falls on staff to come to some consensus at a meeting outside of the transparent public process. So,
okay, I think that's helpful, and I think the way I'm understanding it is also not a decision being made. I think just without a decision being made, kind of everyone's understanding that this is encouraging, this is the best path forward, as you said, kind of saying these are the things to consider kind of moving forward. So I think that's helpful. Thank you.
Commissioner Oath?
Yeah, I'll just be brief and just say, I really like this, and I would be in agreement with it.
Commissioner Messner, do you have further process pieces you wanted to puzzle together for us?
well, it depends on how far down the 300 series you want to go. I mean, this one kind of covers the pre-app stuff. I do have some considerations around Rule 302, around local governments, Rule 303, which are some procedural requirements for oil and gas development plans, but those are further in the application process. So this is all I have for the pre-app stuff. So I can continue down the road if you'd like me to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm comfortable. I think you're on a roll and good work so far. I mean, yeah, why don't you roll into the local government and that whole piece?
Okay.
Is that 302?
Oh, that's 302. So Rule 302 is local government. So this one is hard. I'll start by saying that the current rules indicate that the commission will defer to local government siting disposition for those local governments who regulate oil and gas activity. And when I say current rules, I mean the rules in place right now, not the draft rules. Only in instances when the requirements to do an ALA are not met. And so that's a pretty finite number of applications that we see where there's no alternative location analysis, which means there's no sensitive receptors, high priority habitats, so on and so forth. That in our mission change rulemaking, we made a decision to defer to the local government siting if they regulate oil and gas activity and they've completed their application process before ours. The current rules also indicate, so again, that the commission will only approve applications that meet all of the elements of the Act or protective public health, safety, welfare of the environment, wildlife resources. So that still gives the commission the opportunity to disagree with the local government siting if they don't feel like it's protective. When an application does meet the elements of an ALA, a local government siting disposition is still strongly considered in the review of the application by the commission. And there are times when indeed we have deferred to the local government instead of a location that staff recommended in at least a couple of instances, one for sure. And so that's to say that, you know, this is how we do it currently. Now, the draft, the August draft anticipates an alternative location analysis for every application, but removes that deferral language that are in the current rules and from the August draft, only because everything requires an ALA. And so while I understand the local governments wanting to ensure that the co-equal regulatory authority is preserved in these rules, I mean, I would argue it's in statute as well as the rules. I think my ultimate decision is that the current draft rules that utilize the word consider capture the intent of what our current practice is better than utilization of the word defer, and better than I think what some of the language that was suggested by the Western Rural Local Government and others, because ultimately we're just applying the exact same thing that we do right now. And I think that the consider does that. Now, having said that, I think it's essential that the current process should be clearly captured in captured in the statement of basis and purpose to memorialize this intent. And I also think the current draft preserves the ability for the two processes to either occur in subsequent fashion, with the local government going first, or concurrently with the processes happening at the same time. This is really important. And I think any language besides the word defer or besides the word consider inherently requires the local government to go first. And that's not what happens in action sometimes. The concurrent ends up being a pretty common current practice. And so anyway, that's a long way of saying I think that the draft rule got the language right. And I don't suggest making any edits to the Rule 302 local government piece. But I do think that we have to be clear in the statement of basis and purpose, the memorialization of the co-equal regulatory authorities. And that's a really important piece here. And it needs to be captured throughout the rules, because that local government authority to be able to regulate oil and gas activities within their jurisdiction is core to SB 19-181 in our rules. So that's my long way of saying leave it as it is.
Appreciate those thoughts. I am in agreement. And I say that at the same time saying that I think the current process does a really good job of allowing ECMC to do its work, Will County to do its work, Adams County to do its work, Garfield County to do its work. I think we've really created a good process that allows ECMC to work collaboratively with whatever local governments out there, irrespective of how much they're permitting or how much they may not be permitting. So it's not I think it's just, it is a better articulation of what is happening today. And I think it also makes sense given the fact that, as you pointed out, Commissioner Messner, a lot of this is happening concurrently and provides a definitional structure that accommodates that. Other commissioners with thoughts on that point?
Okay, I can move on then.
Move on then.
Okay, so Rule 303, which is procedural requirements for oil and gas development plans. I'm gonna go pretty fast here. I do have red lines on this, but my red lines in a lot of ways follow a combination of some red lines provided by Oxy and some red lines provided by Green Latinos. But in Rule 303 AIAA, I'm putting instead of with a working, yeah, this basically I'm just shifting 2,000 feet to 1 mile of a residential building unit, high occupancy building unit, school facility, or childcare center within a disproportionately impacted community. This is going to be a pretty common theme. You know, when you go down to Rule 303 E1, who receives notice, all surface owners, building unit owners, and residents, including tenants of both residential and commercial properties, within 2,640 feet, so half a mile of any working pad surface included in the oil and gas development plan, outside of a disproportionately impacted community, or with a residential building unit, high occupancy building unit, school facility, or child care center within 1 mile of any working pad surface included in the oil and gas development plan within a disproportionately impacted communities. And so that's my shift for 303E1A. For Rule 304, and these are the notice requirements that I'm talking about here, so I'm going to go kind of fast, but Rule 304, Form 2A, oil and gas location assessment applications. And Rule B2BIFF, any disproportionately impacted community within 1 mile of each oil and gas location analyzed in the alternative location analysis pursuant to this Rule 304 B2. In B2BIIIAA, for proposed oil and gas locations with a working pad surface within or within 1 mile of a disproportionately impacted community. So that's a change, 2,000 feet. And B7A, change it to a half mile as suggested by Oxy. In J, disproportionately impacted communities map if the proposed oil and gas working pad surface is located within 1 mile of an RBU. In J Romanet 1, again, shifting it to a mile. Romanet 2, shifting it to a mile. Or sorry, that one doesn't have a change to it. That's between 2,000 feet and a mile. And so those are all the changes in Rule 304J. And so Rule 304C19, Community Outreach Plan. And so just so you know, and I don't want to presuppose because I know that you're talking about this, Commissioner or Chairman Robbins, but I'm doing this by removing also all reference of cumulatively impacted community. And so I'm not assuming that that's where you're at. I'm just saying that when I looked at this and applied the proximity approach, I'm assuming that cumulative impacted communities is not going to be utilized. Now it may get utilized and that may shift this. So it's important to know. So community outreach plan for oil and gas locations within half mile of all sensitive receptors, and I'm using sensitive receptors instead of saying RVUs, HOVOs, schools, and childcare centers. Outside of a DIC and within a DIC 1 mile. 304C 19A, same thing. 304C 19B, crossed out 2,000 feet, put a mile. And then C, half mile outside of a DIC and 1 mile inside of a DIC. Continuing on in Rule 304, I have 2 options here. My first option under D, lesser impact areas, is to strike all lesser impact areas. All lesser impact area exemptions. My second choice is if we were to keep lesser impact area exemptions, is that you may not grant an exemption for an oil and gas location that is within 1 mile of an RBU, HOBU, school facility, or child care center within a disproportionately impacted community. The reason that I'm suggesting the striking of lesser impact areas is not that there are not some areas that are going to have lesser impacts, but that inherently in our application process, the application submittal requirements for things that are less impactful are pretty minimal. And so would think that to create some procedural justice and some clarity around our application process, we ask for rules that are we ask for submittals or plans that are required in order for us to be able to review the application. We should have all of the plans submitted in that review of the application, even if the plan indicates that there's a very minimal impact associated with this. And so here's the level of analysis that we did. And so before going on to Rule 306, I'll maybe pause there and see if anyone has any questions about 303 and 304.
I don't know if I've got a question, but I've got just I'm trying to follow along, but I'm not able to do that without taking a look at red lines. But is your thought here, Commissioner Messner, that everything in terms of notice, et cetera, all moves to 1 mile?
Generally, it actually shifts. Generally speaking, it shifts to 1 mile inside of disproportionately impacted communities. And from a notice perspective, goes to a 1/2 mile if it's not in a disproportionately impacted community. And that's generally, there are a couple of exceptions, but that's generally. And the reason, the rationale for the 1/2 mile, and this was recommended by Oxy, was that there are neighborhoods, there are folks that are just outside of 2,000 feet that need to get noticed to be aware of what's happening in their neighborhood. And that's standard practice for land use, that if there's something that's potentially impacted a neighborhood, that you're letting folks know, hey, this is what's happening in your neighborhood in case you have interest in being involved in the process. And so that's for general notice. And that inside of 2,000 feet, there's really very few RBUs that should be inside 2,000 feet as part of the applications. And so we're unnecessarily restricting notice for what may be happening in your neighborhood by limiting it to 2,000 feet. So this is expanding it 640 feet to capture the folks just outside of 2,000 feet that may be close to something that's happening in their neighborhood. The mile is rationalized by the proximity approach that was suggested by Green Latinos. And so in many ways, I'm following their rationale for, how to apply equity instead of equality in disproportionately impacted communities, as in my interpretation, directed by statute. And so that removes cumulatively impacted communities, but it refines that notice and that scope of notice inside of that disproportionately impacted community, not to the whole disproportionately impacted community, but to the potential impact area, which, as talked about when we talked about impact areas, is 1 mile. And so I think rationally it can be incorporated as 1 mile for notice.
I still may need to see red lines to get my head around that. Other commissioners with questions? Commissioner Oath?
And Commissioner Messner, can you say again for 303D, sorry. Where did I go? With 303A, sorry, 303D, yeah, 303D and 303E, what you laid out.
I did not, and I think I might have missed those in my notes, to be honest with you.
Okay,
But generally, like I said, generally speaking, I'm following along with the proximity approach that's suggested by Green Latinos. And so if they made red lines to those, it would probably be something that I considered. But I don't know as D and E. I considered, but give me a second and I can consider it.
okay. Or maybe just the first, I think it was like the first couple that you mentioned. I think I wasn't quite to my draft to see what you were, the track.
So Rule 303A, Romanet 1AA, talks about with a working pad surface within, it says 2,000 feet. I struck that and put 1 mile of an RBU, high occupancy building unit, school facility, or childcare center within a DIC. So if the working pad surface is with 1 mile of a sensitive receptor in a disproportionately impacted community, that would be the change for Rule 303A, Romanet 1, little a. The next one was, and again, when I cut and paste this stuff, sometimes the letters get changed, so I might not be right, but this
I
is
think
the,
you might be in 303D. That's why I'm getting confused. Okay, that's helpful.
yeah.
Okay.
And so under the section that talks about who receives notice for a completeness determination, I have all surface owners, building unit owners, and residents, including tenants of both residential and commercial properties within a half mile of any working pad surface included in the oil and gas development plan, and outside of a disproportionately impacted community, or with a residential building unit, high occupancy building unit, school facility, or childcare center within 1 mile of any working pad surface included in the oil and gas development plan within a disproportionately impacted community. So those are the first two.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this. I'll start off saying with the community outreach, I know that's one of the things that I was looking into as well. And I do think that there's some pretty broad agreement that community outreach plans, meetings, I think it's 304C19. I think most people are in agreement that those should be happening regardless of DIC. And so I'm definitely on board with that. I think where I have some hesitation still is the distances. So we're under your proposal, the notice is expanding to a half mile, kind of broad-based, expanding to a half mile, not DI community, and 1 mile within the DI community, correct? Okay. And I know this is one of the things that is obviously kind of talked about a lot by both sides, kind of going in differing ways here. And I think one of the things that jumps out to me is it is a big jump to go to a mile there. And I think especially as we talk about it, kind of looking at the impacts themselves. And I think part of my hesitancy with this is not looking at the cumulative impact evaluation, because I think the 1 mile area or 2.5 miles for the water, but I think the larger area for the evaluation is appropriate. But one of the things that jumps out to me is a lot of the discussion that we heard about the impacts, especially to public health and the risks of those impacts greatly going down after 2,000 feet. And I think that, you know, not being part of this commission when the mission change rulemaking happened, but my understanding of it is trying to tie it to that information, the studies that were done talking about that risk associated with the health impacts. And so fully on board with one, providing substantive and procedural protections, especially in disproportionately impacted communities. I just think the jump for procedural to a mile is significant. And that's one of the reasons why I tried to ask Green Latinos when we brought them back up for questioning a little bit more on some of the negotiations. I know they had moved to 4,000 feet and getting rid of the DIC. And I'll also say, I hear what the environmental justice community is saying about the CICs. I think my initial thought with it is not detracting from disproportionately impacted community protections, but an added buffer for those communities that are especially impacted. But acknowledging the concerns that they have with the cumulatively impacted communities, I hear them, and I think it is worth getting rid of that decision. And that's one of the reasons why I did not have any conversations with them over the weekend, but I'd be curious to see if they had any ideas or suggestions on kind of movement from that 4,000 feet if the CICs are removed. Just kind of going with that, because I do recognize that they had moved to 4,000 feet. I just see a big jump to the mile for all notice when we're tying it to other things. I want to make sure that we give the voices, which is, I know, part of what we're trying to do here. I just think a mile is a big jump up.
So I'll respond, but I'll just give you my rationale, my understanding. It's not tied to the 2,000-foot study. It's a notice requirement. And so you're saying, hey, something's happening in the neighborhood, and we want to let you know. And I think the application of the half mile generally in things outside of a disproportionately impacted community is an appropriate distance to capture the neighborhood in which this activity is occurring. And so that's why I think the 2640 generally outside of a disproportionately impacted community is appropriate. As to inside a DIC, again, I go to equity versus equality, right? And a disproportionately impacted community is defined as a disproportionately impacted community because it is burdened by a number of different items, including elements associated with pollution, with health impacts, with house cost burdens, with wages, with all of the things that are associated with the EnviroScreen score, and the definition of disproportionately impacted communities. But equity or equality is all things being equal and providing the same to everyone regarding of differences in specific needs. Whereas equity is the process of treating everyone fairly and justly based on their circumstances. Equity acknowledges that people start from different places and allocates resources and opportunities to reach an equal outcome. And so as I read statute in our direction, I interpreted it as requiring additive procedural justice and additive environmental justice in disproportionately impacted communities in order to achieve equity, not equality. And so to me, that's my rationale, and I think it's reasonable to utilize the mile inside of disproportionately impacted communities and a half mile outside.
And I'll say I completely agree with that. I don't disagree with the equity aspect of it. I think some of my concern is just, and I guess I'll start with saying that the equity aspect of it, I don't know that outside the DIC, we need to increase it that much as well. It's more of a, we can increase it and we should increase, especially the procedural notifications we're talking about with respect to disproportionately impacted communities, but increasing it to the, I know it's been proposed at a half mile. I know Green Latinos came back and said 4,000 feet is what they were talking about. I think the jump to a mile is broad, is one of the things I'm saying. And recognizing that notice is different than the health impact studies, I think there's also a good reason to create, the reason it was initially created at 2,000 feet is tied to that. You're more likely to have an impact at 2,000 feet, and therefore that's what's contributing to the notice. And so the 2,000 feet for the non-DIC, because that's where you have the increased risk of a health impact of that noticing. And then we can increase it, and we should increase it for disproportionately impacted communities. And I think that's where Oxy was coming from, and other members of industry coming from as well, with let's go out to a half mile, let's do it. But at the same time, we also were hearing from a lot of them, doing it at a mile is also asking a lot for some of these procedural aspects of it. I realize that's
Other commissioners, go ahead, Commissioner Cross.
I was just going to say, I realize that's more kind of deliberative thoughts as opposed to questions there, but I just wanted to make sure.
We go back and forth. Others that want to chat about this idea, Commissioner Ackerman?
Yeah, again, I appreciate your work on this, Commissioner Messner, and your comments, Commissioner Cross. And I guess I'm moving a little bit towards deliberative thoughts as well. I don't have any further questions associated with this, but and I do recognize, as stated by Commissioner Cross, that this will result in many cases, significant additional notice that will have to be provided by operators, especially in DIC communities that are denser in population. And I understand that, and I don't take that effort lightly. That's a lot of work. I believe a cost benefit analysis of that additional notice work is warranted, given the DIC history of impacts and given the specific direction to protect DICs in statute. I generally support additional expanded notice within DICs, and I support Commissioner Messner's suggestions. I believe they're in line with the legislative intent to increase protection in DICs.
Commissioner Cross?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will say, I think one clarification is also important. I think the notice aspect we're talking about, I think it might be appropriate to characterize it as disclosure, just because of the inherent legal terminology that's tied to notice. Regardless of what happens with the increased disclosure, I just want to make sure we're not affecting the affected party status with respect to notice. I think that's an important thing to highlight.
And just so you know, Commissioner Cross, in some instances, I think it is appropriate to use notice. I think it's okay to use disclosure in other scenarios, because sometimes it actually is notice, right, as part of our formal process. And sometimes it's a disclosure. And so I'm happy to go through and look at particular instances, but I don't want to use the word disclosure when it is in fact notice.
Commissioner Messner, do you have all this hyped up? I mean, before I weigh in, I'd really like to sort of be able to take a look at red lines and try to get a fuller understanding of the places you're making changes and which ones move into a half mile versus which one is a mile, et cetera. I think that would help me get my head around all this.
I do have it typed up. I have it typed up for my notes, not intending to share it. However, and so I only say that because I may have to clean it up a little bit so you guys can understand it. But I have something that can be shared, yes.
Well, I think getting a share would help at least this commissioner try to get my head around it. I agree with all the things around notice and protections to DI. I start to wonder about a 1 mile neighborhood. That seems like a pretty expansive neighborhood. So again, I'd kind of like to see what it is you've put on paper. And if you need to work with the AAGs to help you get it cleaned up, and then maybe we can come back to this. You know, we've got several days set aside to sort of noodle through a lot of different things. So maybe you could do that, and then we could revisit this and maybe put just kind of a hold on this piece right now until we can take a look at it. Commissioner O, you raised your hand.
I did. Can I riff on your idea a little bit and see if staff, as they work with Commissioner Messner on this, might even be able to like just put it in a table or something, right? So we can, rather than like each of the provisions that, for me anyways, that could help me conceptualize what what we're looking at.
Ms. Trask, is that something that's doable?
Yeah, we can definitely build some sort of a table with options for this.
Okay. What I would suggest is we put a hold on this discussion at this point, and then let's revisit it. The second thing I would suggest is let's take 5 minutes or so and come back at 4:06. And at that point, I'd like to recognize, I'd like to move us beyond this and kind of move to a different direction. Let's talk about something different. And I'd like to possibly see if I could recognize Commissioner Ackerman on biological resources and wildlife and all things around that, just to kind of mix it up and talk about different things.
Sure.
All right, see you in 5. Hey, welcome back. This is the Energy and Carbon Management Commission continuing its debate on cumulative impacts and enhanced systems and practices. Rulemaking. Commissioner Ackerman, can I recognize you to talk things wildlife and biological resources?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the opportunity. I certainly have given some thought to wildlife thresholds, some CIDR inclusions, the cumulative impacts report, all as they relate to wildlife. I think given where we're at in the day here, I would like to defer those potentially for future discussion, but want to make sure that we treat them at some point. But I did want to focus on biological resources, and certainly am happy to move into other concepts if we choose to do so. But I wanted to kind of the way that I thought about this was after review, certainly of all the hearing materials and the submissions by the parties. You know, it became very clear to me that there was a lot of very, very thoughtful input from a lot of very smart people. I think it would behoove us to thank the Biological Resources Working Group formally in some way if we didn't do that after their first report. And they did a lot of work, and certainly those that have worked on legislation associated with this issue and studies and discussions on biological resources at all levels have been very impactful to the state as a whole on this issue, and I'm excited to move forward with it. And I appreciate the persistence of many groups and individuals on this topic. It's not only noble and ethical, but really ecologically imperative that we protect the organisms, systems, and processes that sustain life. I think this commission made great strides in a lot of areas at the mission change rulemaking. I think wildlife was one of them. I think people were excited to see biological resources topics move forward in the same kind of light. And there are many who have been disappointed because they have not yet. I don't believe that's a deficiency on the part of the commission. I think that we had some serious difficulties with legislative and statutory authority associated with parts of biological resources, and I think those have been addressed. And so I do think we're in a position where we can strongly move forward on biological resources. And I have 4 main recommendations associated with the biological resources discussion. I'm happy to go through them all and talk about them after, happy to pause if anyone wants to interrupt me as well. So the first recommendation would be on a biological resources definition. And my recommendation would be to include a definition in this rulemaking as suggested by CPW and supported by many others who address the issue. And so that would be defining biological resources as invertebrates and rare plants and their terrestrial and aquatic habitats. I thought about a broad spectrum of possible definition approaches when I was thinking about this, and certainly prior to and during these hearings, and kind of coalesced on 3 main approaches. And the first one would be to leave a definition out of the regulations entirely. We've heard that some. It's not included in our draft regulations in August. And some of my thinking around that was that the legislature didn't define many of the terms in Senate Bill 181 and House Bill 1294 in 3460-106 that includes protective clauses such as air and water and soil and noise and odor and even wildlife. And biological resources was also included in that list. They did define some other terms in that list, like impacts to climate and DICs, demonstrating that they did have specific intent on certain items there. And so there's an argument for not defining biological resources at all. And leaving the definition out of the regulations would arguably, in my thinking, be more inclusive and protective of all things biological, as the commonly understood term biological resources is really very, very broad in and of itself. And that might allow for further administrative discussion of what can and should be included or further regulated under that broad term. We heard significant input on the narrowed down definition of biological resources that it remained too broad and would make programs very difficult to implement. And I agree with that. And so for that reason, I've shied largely away from this option. The Biological Resources Working Group report gave us further insight on the concept of whether or not we should define the term. And it says in there, the Biological Resources Working Group was not directed to draft a definition for biological resources, but the group agreed that developing a working definition would be useful to frame the relevant data sources. And it further stated the group agreed as well that any potential future rulemaking regarding the incorporation of biological resources into the Commission's rules, excuse me, would benefit from including a definition. Also noting that a rulemaking would allow for further stakeholder and public input toward refining or revising this or another proposed definition. So certainly the Biological Resources Working Group contemplated where they were at and where we might go in a rulemaking. And as you heard in this hearing, really, to me, essentially all testimonies either directly or indirectly referenced the utility of having a definition of biological resources. And further, we do define wildlife resources in the 100 series of ECMC regulations, although it was not defined in the statute. And we did that and specifically followed that up with a 1200 series focused specifically upon the protection of that defined term. And many agree that that approach, myself included, has led to considerable improvement in the protection of wildlife as it relates to oil and gas development in the state. So I think it's reasonable to conclude that it is in the best interest of programmatic clarity, of predictability, and protection of biological resources to include a definition. So that brings me on to the second consideration, and that's the Biological Resources Working Group recommendation. And I thought also, like a lot of people mentioned, that might be a good place to start, as the Biological Resources Working Group spent a lot of time and effort considering a definition. And as I noted during the hearing, I do have concerns with implementing the definition suggested as a working definition by the Biological Resources Working Group. I think that definition was well crafted for the purpose of helping the group fulfill its mandate at the time and suggesting a starting place to the Commission for further refinement. And I don't want to rehash and reiterate those concerns. You heard them during the hearing, but I'm happy to detail them again if our discussion takes us down that path. The Biological Resource Working Group's key consideration statement on definitions said that their intent was to consider when biological resources should or should not be inclusive of wildlife resources, and how the limitations of statutory authority beyond wildlife resources would impact that definition. And these are the two primary difficulties associated with the definition proposed by the Biological Resources Working Group, which was, as you know, proposed at a time that there was no statutory authority of any agency over any aspect of biological resources that has generally been considered as such. I also recognize the difficulty associated with wildlife resources being obviously part of biological resources, but it creates considerable difficulty including it as such in our regulatory schema. And you heard CPW recommend decoupling those two terms, and I agree with that approach. The working definition, as I mentioned, was created really under a different statutory understanding for invertebrates and rare plants. And really what the Biological Resources Working Group was trying to do is get their arms around some degree of how are we going to approach specifically pollinators and rare plants in Colorado. And they noted a number of times in the Biological Resources Working Group that a specific driver of their discussions and a specific difficulty of the task was the lack of statutory authority over those items in the state. So I think it's important that we recognize since then the shift in statutory authority that was brought about by House Bill 241117, and Parks and Wildlife now has statutory authority over invertebrates and rare plants. So I think narrowing the definition from the working definition suggested by the Biological Resources Working Group to the definition suggested by CPW is consistent with the recommendations of the Biological Resources Working Group, who noted that stakeholdering and revision in rulemaking may be necessary, would be necessary. And I do think it's particularly appropriate in conjunction with the House Bill 1117 filling of that statutory void that caused the group so much consternation. So that brings me to the third point, not third point, but the third aspect of the definition, which is as I said, defining it in this rulemaking as invertebrates and rare plants and their terrestrial and aquatic habitats. Rare plants and invertebrates are the primary biological resources components that have driven this discussion since before Senate Bill 181. That's discussion over those resources is what resulted in the DNR pollinator study bill, and then ultimately further resulted in House Bill 1117. Defining it as such in these regulations cleans up the legal overlap issue with wildlife regulations and decoupling them as suggested by CPW. And it really does dovetail with inclusion of a number of existing and proposed regulations that are protective of biological resources that are either in our regulations currently or are proposed for inclusion as part of the August draft. So defining the term now rather than waiting does add some real clarity to the application of those existing and proposed regulations. Some of those are, inclusion of the term right now in the definitions of best management practices, cumulative impacts, pollution, responsible party, the effective scope of rules, consideration in approvals, in caps, and then proposed rules in cumulative impacts data and analysis, and a number of others that I won't detail. So I think it's a timely, effective opportunity to specifically address and protect those resources that are most in question when talking about biological resources and that have been the primary drivers of the biological resources discussion. And even more, and I'll get into a recommendation for a working group, it allows a working group to really focus on the substantive protection measures for those primary intended components rather than spending time and effort on issues that were already discussed and deliberated by the original biological resources working group. So that's my first recommendation. My second recommendation, and that would require, of course, inclusion of that definition into the regulations as a regulatory change from the August draft regulations. My second recommendation gave this considerable thought as well. You heard a lot of discussion or some discussion about including CNHP habitat PCAs of varying levels as potential consultation triggers on this issue. I want to acknowledge that the great work that's being done at CNHP, it's a very important resource, but it's not really intended for this purpose. And, I recognize the importance of examining those CNHP PCAs and other relevant data for potential inclusion in a program to ultimately protect biological resources. We heard CPW express concerns that while those data will almost certainly inform the process for protection of invertebrates and rare plants, it's not curated by CPW, and its purpose really was not intended to trigger consultations by that agency. And I agree with that. And I feel that using PCAs in a kind of as an ad hoc CPW process in the interim prior to further programmatic development would really generally result in a disorganized, vague, and somewhat empty consultative process on those specific habitat blocks. Instead, my opinion is that we should rely on interim protective measures for biological resources through inclusion of the swap habitat type protections that you see in the proposed August regulations. And I don't want to abandon the idea of CNHP PCAs informing the process. And I think it would be appropriate to leave that consultation trigger discussion to a working group in conjunction with a process to stand up more extensive invertebrate and rare plant protection programs with CPW pursuant to House Bill 1117. And I would expect that group to consider Codex and CNHP data and all of the relevant data in generating its recommendations. And so the next recommendation associated with that would be that those interim protective measures should be those habitat types that are listed in broad habitat category protection in the SWAP as noted in the regulations under Chapter 3, Table 4. And just wanted to specify that those are 36 very broad habitat categories, generally all of the wildlife habitat categories in Colorado, and include such things as broad things like spruce and fir forest, sagebrush, upland shrub, riparian, and different woodlands and playas and much more. I did want to kind of pause there and address this issue of including barrens in that list. Barrens are specifically not included in that list of wildlife habitat. There's a lot of discussion in the swap about barrens later on that were kind of brought on in a little bit of a later process in the swap. And barrens are really the only habitat type that are listed in the swap that are listed as important to the protection of rare plants that aren't also listed in the table 4 that I just recognized. So it would be important to me to include barrens together with that table. They were included, like I mentioned, a bit later in the swap, and barrens do occupy about just a small percentage of Colorado, about 1%, but they do support about 20% of Colorado's rarest plants. So inclusion of that together with the other categories in that table would be helpful towards the protection of rare plants, and appreciate that suggestion. I believe it was by the hunting and angling groups. Approaching it in this way would help CPW determine potential impacts at their consultations at a more workable level, considering what they have currently to work with. And they can make appropriate recommendations based on species user groups for the affected habitat. So for example, if the affected habitat is sage, it's pretty easy from there for CPW to narrow down into what species might be impacted in the sage habitat, include those in their consultative process at that time. So what that really means, if we include the regulations that I've just mentioned, so that they're already in the August draft with the exception of barrens, for biological resources, what that means is that at the OGDP and the CAP level and the cumulative impacts analysis level, this is a broad summary, but essentially what will be required is that an operator will have to detail their disturbance, their total and post-reclamation disturbance. They'll have to break down by acreage of the types of current uses that'll be disturbed by a proposed operation, particularly in those habitats that I just mentioned. They have to do a quantitative, or where quantitative info is not reasonably available, a qualitative evaluation of all the incremental impacts on those habitats that are listed in the swap. They'll have to quantify short and long-term vegetation disturbance. They'll have to provide a narrative description of the evaluations that have been conducted to determine impacts to biological resources. And then they'll have to describe relevant best management practices and ESPs to avoid and minimize and mitigate impacts to biological resources, including those in those broad habitat categories from the swap. And then they'll have to implement those, specific BMPs, including detailing how each ESP or BMP minimizes impacts to BR, or to biological resources, sorry. And so the reason I went down this road is I think this process is a good interim process and is more broadly protective and executable in a consultative process in the interim than a CNHP PCA based approach would be. And again, an even broader protective approach, at least under current mapping and programmatic conditions. And it remains fluidly protective as new information is discovered about species that might be in those habitats in Colorado, and as CPW continues to develop its programs. And I think that it would be important to recognize in the statement of basis and purpose that this reliance upon the swap habitat type documentation and protection at the CAP and OGDP level is intended by the commission to be an interim protective measure, pending some follow-up rulemaking pursuant to recommendations of a reconvened working group, which, and I know this is lengthy, I'm getting towards the end here, brings me to my 4th point, which is to recommend a working group. I think I would ask us to recommend a working group with a different name than biological resources, so not necessarily reconvening. I don't want to confuse the efforts of this group. I think they'll be distinctly different than the original biological resources working group, and that group did a good job of fulfilling its original purpose, and that purpose was largely focused around attempting to fill the statutory void that was the lack of statutory authority around the conservation and protection of invertebrates and rare plants. So I would want to task this group specifically with brainstorming a potential biological resources regulatory series that's patterned after our 1200 series. And I mentioned I would like to suggest that. I think that's exactly what CPW suggested, and I support that suggestion. And I would suggest we can talk about this later, but calling it the Pollinators and Plants Working Group or something like that. I thought about the Plants and Entomology Science Team, but I didn't think PEST would be a good acronym, so I stayed away from that one. But I think we can come up with a name that recognizes the work that we asked them to do. We've been asked to consider professional facilitation for that group. I think it's a good idea. I am open to including deadlines for a working group report. Folks have said they would need at least a year to, as you heard it, have the intellectual food fight and kind of hash out what we think might be an appropriate regulatory program going forward. And so I think that if we want to address a deadline, I think the end of 2025 for a report to the commission would be an appropriate deadline. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. Those discussions can be tied somewhat into the updated swap, which is due about a year from now. And they coincide with CPW's expected kind of stand-up process for a programmatic approach to invertebrates and rare plants pursuant to 1117. I do think, while I'm not recommending that the commission set for itself a specific deadline for rulemaking. I get the reason that groups have suggested that, and I do think that the statement of basis and purpose could benefit from an inclusion of a specific intent for us to expeditiously take up a separate rulemaking or appropriate action associated with the reconvened working group's recommendations. And the reason I say that is because I do think conditions could exist in which the working group comes back with a report and recommendations, and we have significant discussion and ask them to do more work associated with that. I wouldn't want to prematurely hold a rulemaking based on a preset date before we had all that information. But again, I do want to reiterate, I get that people want us to expeditiously take up this issue, and I would recommend that we do. And then finally, just wanted to, if we do reconvene a working group, certainly express my interest in helping establish and working with that kind of a reconvened group. So in brief summary, define it as CPW suggested and as I've detailed, which would be an inclusion in the August draft regulations. Include the regulations otherwise as proposed in the August draft, except for we include barrens along with the other swap habitats to be evaluated. That we convene a working group specifically for the purpose of developing a suggested procedural practice forward on biological resources. And I think that is about it, I think. So lengthy, thanks for sticking with me. I'm happy to discuss.
Question, Commissioner Ackerman. Really appreciate laying all of that out for us. Everyone want to say me too? Commissioner Ackerman?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. And I would note that, in the considerable conversation that took place in the hearings, while we didn't reach consensus, I think a lot of groups worked very hard to find a place that is a good path forward. And I do think this is that place and look forward to moving forward with the issue.
Agree. All right. Commissioners, does anybody have a good place we could turn for 20 minutes or so before we break for the afternoon? And yeah, Commissioner Messner.
Well, I should be careful what I say, but I think I have an easy one here. And that's definition of disproportionately impacted communities and the inclusion of the full statutory definition.
Okay. Why don't you go there? Let's see if you're right.
Well, that's it.
Just do it that way.
Right now, the definition
drops out
3 sections, and then my suggestion would just be to include the whole statutory definition.
Commissioner Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm generally in favor of this. I think the one that jumps out to me is the inclusion of the tribal lands. And if I remember right, I think some of staff is reaching out to the tribes if they have a preference on being included or not included, since we don't regulate them. So I think that's the one that kind of jumps out is, do we want to wait and see on that?
Yeah, I think I heard that as well. Commissioner Messner, were you, here comes staff, they'll help us out.
We do have a meeting scheduled tomorrow, I believe midday, with some of the tribal representatives to try to answer some of these questions. So I might ask that we defer this conversation until we have their direct input.
Can I ask one question about it? Because there, and I often get confused about this, but there's some finite regulatory responsibility that ECMC has inside the exterior boundaries of the Southern Ute tribe, and I don't remember what that is or for what reason that is, but does that play into this at all, I guess?
I might defer to our AAGs. I believe it's in our current 200 series. I'm trying to find that right now.
AAG Mercer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I should actually read the rule language to be super certain on this, but I believe it's essentially when it is a fee project, meaning that the surface location is on a surface that is privately owned in fee by someone who is not the tribe, and they're developing fee minerals, so not tribal minerals. I believe in that circumstance, the commission has some jurisdiction. I think it's also worth noting that because we take, or it sounds like the commission will be taking a proximity approach to protections for disproportionately impacted communities, there could be a situation where the location itself is just outside of a tribal boundary, but then there are disproportionately impacted community member residences within the reservation who are, you know, within 2,000 feet or a half mile or whatever it might be of the location. So those are some of the factors there.
So I think what we'll do is we kind of see where we want to go on this point, but let's wait for final determination until after we hear back from staff. That's fair enough.
Sure, I told you it wasn't gonna be easy.
Yeah. What else? Commissioner Ackerman?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I don't mean to commandeer, but I certainly could move into this concept of wildlife, of thresholds associated with wildlife. That was also on my list. And I think a considerably shorter discussion than biological resources. This is a hard question, and where everyone struggles with thresholds on every front. You heard this from Dr. McMullen on the concept of air, is that how do you move a very fluid circumstance in very fluid environment into some kind of stable and predictable and defensible thresholds to initiate specific actions or a mandate of no action. And I would say the same is for wildlife as is for air, which is, and maybe even more so, they're very mobile, it's difficult. So where everybody struggles is setting those triggers. I would recognize that we do have some thresholds in our regulations to some degree. Indirect impacts of wildlife is set based on thresholds of achieving a certain number or of a certain number of existent oil and gas operations in a certain area. And so the calculations that CPW uses to calculate indirect impacts or potential indirect impacts is kind of a bit of a foray into this issue. My short answer, Mr. Chair, is I don't think we're at all prepared to start proposing specific thresholds for wildlife in any way. And it's because those thresholds will be different for different species in different locations during different times and under different conditions. And generally, to some degree, are addressed during our wildlife consultative process. Quite well, I might add, with regard to best management practices and ESPs associated with impacts specifically to that operation. And back to the age-old question of how do we extract, how do we take that data, excuse me, and move it into a more of a cumulative impacts analysis that would then say, because there is a threshold somewhere. There's a threshold that if you move so many of such a type of an operation into habitat, those wildlife will abandon that habitat. Now, we did hear some specific conversation about disturbance to wildlife that I thought was well done, but it's important to also notice that disturbance to wildlife does not equal in any way abandonment of wildlife, of the use of that habitat. It certainly can increase stressors. It can increase even mortality to a species that's escape focused like ungulates. And so there are issues there. And so this is one that I've been pondering, and like Dr. McMillan, cannot come up with a specific expert answer with regard to wildlife, but I do have some ideas on a path forward. Number one, I don't think we're the appropriate entity to establish thresholds for wildlife. Much like we've talked about with regard to air, and I know we'll certainly talk more about that. We've heard from CDPHE requests to allow their agency and their boards to be the regulators of those resources, and for us not to set potentially conflicting or additional or to some degree potentially uninformed other regulations that would then dictate actions. So I do think it's important to continue to work on the threshold issue. I think that we can get to a place where we start to really determine, okay, maybe this doesn't cause wildlife abandonment of a certain place, like a lek, which we have pretty good information on. But like winter range of deer, we can start to talk about years when there's significant hard winters and high mortality, that they'll be under a lot more strain than in other years. And so I kind of teased this a little bit earlier on, but we each year have our cumulative impacts director's report. And as part of that director's report, the director is asked to report to us on any additional science, any additional best management practices, other practices or improvements or advancements in the industry or in protective categories of the industry that are listed in that regulation, and to take those into account and even potentially suggest potential commission actions associated with those. And so I think with just a little bit of an inclusion in those regulations, they're in the 900 series, and I won't go through specifically the regulatory language, but certainly I've got some thoughts on that and have some draft, but I'm not sure I'm ready to say this is the language that we need. But I think that if we included some type of consultation with CPW and CDPHE into that specific aspect of the director's report, with the focus being, all right, what happened this year that was exceptionally difficult? What did we see that really did create hardship for wildlife? Where can we lessen the impacts in the year to come, both geographically and potentially from a practice standpoint? Then I think we could get some potential recommendations from the director in that report, even annually, that kind of work real time on this dynamic issue of thresholds. I'm a little slow to call it thresholds at that point, but I do think that could certainly inform us and be more protective of wildlife from a more cumulative standpoint. So again, my restatement of my position on this is I don't think that we're in a position where we can start to establish thresholds as part of this rulemaking. I don't think that we're the appropriate entity to establish what those thresholds might be. But I do think it would behoove us to work strongly with CPW to talk about real cumulative impact potential limitations in wildlife habitat due to either conditions or overdevelopment of certain areas. And I think, as far as I can figure, the annual report is the best tool that I can think of to move that forward.
Thank you for the report. Questions? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Commissioner Ackerman. So I don't disagree with you that it's difficult for this agency to develop thresholds. I guess I'm struggling a little bit to see how the annual cumulative impacts report is going to aid us in developing thresholds, because as I read the annual report every year, it really just talks about the impacts that happened the previous year. You know, I was compelled by the testimony that talked about the utilization of the Codex database to help develop, you know, at least existing surface impacts and how that information may or may not be able to tie into consultations with CPW. You know, I heard from CPW in their testimony that thresholds is a really important, you know, habitat fragmentation, baselines, thresholds are all really important for them in order to be able to evaluate cumulative impacts. But how that happens, you know, is it something that we develop where we're finally evaluating these impacts 10 years from now, or is there something that we can do in the interim to start to take stronger steps? And so these are the questions that at least I had in my notes as to, you know, around this topic of thresholds, and how CPW can, in their consultations, can better utilize thresholds, and most importantly, how we can provide better information through our CIDR database into something other than our cumulative impacts report that may holistically create better information for, you know, helping determine thresholds at some point so that we can utilize those in a regulatory approach. I don't know, those are not really a question on your.
No, they're good points.
But,
Oh, excuse me.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, they're good points and they're right on point, Commissioner Messner. I think we're relatively aligned here. I think that a couple of points. Number one, the CIDR discussion, I do think we need to continue to have. I've got that in my notes as something that was assigned to me as well. And I think you're right on point that we need to improve CIDR, and we certainly need to improve overall mapping of oil and gas developments, oil and gas disturbance. We need to, in my opinion, go back historically and map all operations that are out there and create a surface impact layer map of oil and gas development in Colorado that's as real time as we can possibly get it to be. As CPW said, that would be a considerable tool in helping them to evaluate potential cumulative impacts at the OGDP and cap level stage, and maybe be able to provide some recommendations that help steer those processes on the ground at that time. As to your second point, I see where you're coming from on the report from the director, but that's my thought of inclusion, of course, you know, well, I'll back up on the base layer map. Frankly, what CPW needs is a base layer map of all surface disturbance in the state of all kinds. That's what they need. I think what we could do is one that certainly provides one with oil and gas. And there are other layers out there that could be overlain on top of, and I know CNHP does a pretty good job of doing that. And so I think we could explore that idea. I'm a little reluctant to say that that's ECMC's bailiwick to create a statewide all disturbance database. But I do think we need to talk about that. I think that will help. And so if CPW had an all disturbance database like that, again, it would inform their cumulative impacts recommendations on an OGDP by OGDP level on the ground, like you're talking about. But also, I think if you couple that with, and this is why I included potentially consultation with CPW and CDPHE on these points in the director's report, because it would give those agencies an opportunity to sit down with us and essentially say, here are the trends that we saw that we think we could actually mitigate from a cumulative standpoint of what's taken place on a year-to-year basis. The final component of that is that the report, yes, is intended to be a report, but it specifically directs the director to provide recommendations, even potentially for rulemakings associated with commission action on cumulative impacts. And so I agree that it would take some work, but I do think that it's a potential avenue.
Commissioner Oath?
No, thank you. My question was just answered by Commissioner Ackerman right there at the end, so thank you.
All right, further questions, thoughts on these points? All right. Commissioners, I'm inclined to call it a day and let us go back to work on our respective topics. I know I've got some work to do this evening. Does anybody have a strong concern about that? All right, seeing none, I need to start us up tomorrow morning at 9:20. I've got a conflict at 9 that I have to take care of. So with that, good afternoon's worth of work today. To the 74 participants, thank you for being with us. And we will continue this matter until September 24th at 9:20, in which case we will reconvene and start back in. Thanks.